Celeste Veron walked into that hospital room like she owned it. Seraphina was lying there, 7 months pregnant, IV lines in both arms, monitors beeping steady warnings that nobody seemed to care enough to answer, and Celeste walked in wearing 4-inch heels and a silk blouse, and that particular smile that women like her had perfected over decades of practice. The smile that said, "I have already won, and you don't know it yet." She pulled the belt from the loops of her coat. Not slowly, not theatrically, just pulled it free the way you'd pull a tool from a drawer because you'd already decided what needed to be done. The first strike landed across Seraphina's left forearm before the nurse call button was even within reach. Seraphina didn't scream. She bit down hard enough to taste blood and curled herself around her stomach the way every mother does when the world turns violent, not protecting herself, protecting the child, always the child first. Even when the second strike came across her shoulder, even when the third caught the side of her face. The monitors screamed what Seraphina wouldn't. And somewhere across this city, in a room full of armed men and expensive whiskey, Dante Moretti's phone buzzed with a hospital number he had already decided he was too important to answer. If you've ever loved someone who refused to see what was being done to you, stay with this story. If you've ever protected someone who didn't protect you back, you already know how this ends. And if this is your first time on this channel, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell here don't let go of you. Drop your city and your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled, like this video if Seraphina deserves better, because she does. Now let me take you back to where all of this started. Before the hospital, before the belt, before Dante Moretti became a man who had to live with what he chose. Seraphina Vale was not the kind of woman who made a room go quiet when she walked in. That was the thing about her that nobody who loved her ever quite found the words to explain. She didn't command attention. She didn't perform. She had a quality that was harder to name, the kind of stillness that made people feel, in her presence, that whatever they were carrying was safe to put down for a minute, like the air around her was slightly easier to breathe. She had grown up in the kind of household where that quality got trained into you early or beaten out of you entirely. Her father, Enzo Vale, had been a careful man. Not cruel, not warm either. Careful. He kept his affections measured and his disappointments quiet, and his expectations so precisely calibrated that Seraphina had spent most of her childhood trying to earn a fullness of love that was always just slightly beyond what he gave. She had learned, because of this, to be grateful for partial things, to take the warmth that was offered and not ask for the warmth that wasn't. She had thought, when she met Dante Moretti, that she had finally encountered someone who gave without measure. She had been wrong about that. But she had not been wrong about everything. She had been right that Dante was capable of love. She had been right that underneath the cold machinery of the man he'd built himself into, the enforced silences, the calculated violence, the empire maintained through fear and favors, and the occasional disappearance, there was something real, something that flinched, something that, in the private hours when no one was watching, reached toward light the way all living things do. She had simply underestimated how long it would take for that something to cost him enough to matter. They had met 6 years ago. She'd been 26, working as a translator for an international trade firm that did, as she would later understand, considerably more than facilitate legitimate commerce. Dante had been 34 and already untouchable. He had come to a meeting that everyone in the room treated like a visitation from something elemental, the way you'd behave if thunder walked in and sat down and asked for coffee. Seraphina had not behaved that way. She had looked at him across the conference table, noted the way every other person in the room had adjusted their posture when he entered, and thought, he's used to that. He's bored of it. He doesn't even know he's bored because he's never been without it. She had handed him the wrong file, a genuine mistake, not a calculated one, and corrected herself with a composed apology that contained zero deference and zero performance. Just, I apologize, that was my error. Here is the correct document. He had looked at her for 3 full seconds before taking the file. 3 seconds was a long time, in a room full of people who didn't look Dante Moretti in the eyes. They had dinner 6 days later. She had told him, at that dinner, 3 true things that she suspected no one in his circle had told him in years. That his reputation preceded him in ways that were not all flattering, that she had read enough about his business interests to understand they were not all legal, and that she was willing to have a second dinner if he could manage to have one conversation with her that wasn't a performance of power. He had laughed. She had never told anyone about that laugh. It would have ruined his reputation, and she had already decided, even then, that whatever happened, she would protect the parts of him he couldn't protect himself. That had been her first mistake. Not the last, but the first. The second dinner became 12. 12 became a year. The year became an engagement that his inner circle received with the particular silence of men who were calculating how a wife would affect their access to the boss. Seraphina had noticed every calculating face at that announcement dinner and had filed each one away with the precision of someone who had grown up learning to read rooms. She had noticed Celeste Veron. Celeste had been with Dante's organization for 4 years before Seraphina arrived. She was 31, French-educated, fluent in 4 languages, and possessed of a face that could arrange itself into whatever expression the room required. She was Dante's communications director, which was a title that explained perhaps 20% of what she actually did. The other 80% involved managing relationships, filtering information, and understanding, better than almost anyone outside the inner sanctum, which levers moved Dante Moretti. Celeste had congratulated Seraphina at that announcement dinner with a warmth so precisely calibrated that Seraphina had recognized it immediately for what it was, a threat wearing the costume of a courtesy. She had smiled back. She had also started paying very close attention. The first year of marriage had been, against all reasonable expectation, something close to good. Dante was not easy. I was suspicious by constitution, controlled by habit, and incapable of the small emotional availabilities that most people took for granted. He would not, for instance, tell her directly that he had missed her. He would show up unexpectedly at places she mentioned wanting to visit. He would remember, with strange precision, every minor preference she'd ever expressed and act on them without commentary. He showed love the way certain animals survive, sideways, quietly, through acts that could be denied if questioned. Seraphina had learned to read his language. She had also learned his organization. Not because Dante invited her into it. He was careful, in the early months, to keep her at a deliberate distance from anything operational. But Seraphina had grown up the daughter of a careful man, and she had inherited his attentiveness to detail. She listened, she observed, she understood, within 8 months of their marriage, considerably more about the structure and vulnerabilities of Dante's empire than he had intended any wife to know. She also understood within those same 8 months that someone inside his organization was working against him. The signs were small. A deal that fell through after what should have been a secure negotiation. A rival faction's apparent foreknowledge of a location that had only been shared internally. A pattern of small failures that, taken individually, could each be attributed to bad luck or human error, but taken together described something deliberate. She had brought her concerns to Dante. Once, carefully. Framed as questions rather than conclusions, because she understood his ego well enough to know that conclusions presented by a wife would be received as interference. He had listened with the patience of a man who has decided in advance not to hear something, and then told her that running an organization of this complexity produced constant friction, and that she was seeing patterns where there was only noise. She had not pushed. She had gone back to watching. The pregnancy had not been planned. Neither of them had said so aloud, because saying so felt like an accusation, and Seraphina was already carefully managing too many unspoken things. But when the test came back positive and she had told Dante in their kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning, she had watched something happen to his face that she had only seen twice before. That brief, uncontrolled expression of a man who has been reached somewhere he thought was armored. He had kissed her forehead. For a man like Dante Moretti, that was a declaration. The complications had started at 5 months. Her blood pressure was elevated in ways that her doctor described carefully, and her body confirmed violently. Headaches that arrived like weather events, exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could reach, swelling that didn't behave the way normal pregnancy swelling behaved. She was placed on modified bed rest, activity restricted. Stress, the doctor told Dante directly, with the kind of eye contact that was meant to communicate seriousness to a man accustomed to deciding which information was real. Stress is a clinical danger to your wife and child. This is not a preference. This is a medical instruction. Dante had nodded. He had also not changed a single thing. The calls continued at all hours. The men continued cycling through their home at unpredictable intervals. The operational crises, and there were always operational crises, continued to consume him at precisely the time Seraphina needed him most. I was not cruel about it. That was the particular damage of it. He was not cruel. He was simply absent in the way that powerful men learn to be absent, convincingly present in the room while being entirely unreachable inside it. Celeste had begun visiting. The first visit was framed as a professional courtesy. There were documents that required Dante's attention, and Dante was occupied, and Celeste had offered to drop them at the residence. Reasonable. Efficient. The kind of thing a competent communications director would do. Seraphina had watched Celeste walk through her front door and felt, with an animal certainty that required no evidence, that this was not about documents. She had offered tea. Celeste had declined. They had sat in the living room for 11 minutes while Celeste waited for Dante, and in those 11 minutes they had conducted, beneath the surface of pleasant small talk about nothing, a negotiation so precise and so polite that neither of them would ever have been able to describe it accurately to a third party. Seraphina. I see you. Celeste. I know you do. Seraphina. He doesn't. Celeste. Not yet. Dante had appeared and taken his documents, and Celeste had left, and that evening, over a dinner that Seraphina had been supposed to rest instead of cooking, Dante had said, as though commenting on weather, Celeste thinks you've been overexerting yourself. She's concerned. Seraphina had looked at her husband. She had recognized the shape of what was beginning, and she had made in that moment a decision that would cost her everything. She had decided not to fight it directly, because fighting it directly with a man like Dante meant becoming the problem. It meant the concern and the paranoia and the narrative that someone else was writing about her became the story. And she would be left defending herself against a version of herself she didn't recognize while the actual threat moved freely. She would watch. She would document. She would find the real evidence of what Celeste was doing, and she would put it in front of Dante in a way he could not dismiss. She had not accounted for running out of time. The visits from Celeste became more frequent as Seraphina's condition worsened, and the distance between her and Dante widened. By month 6, Celeste was at the house 3 times a week. By month 7, Seraphina had been admitted to the private hospital. Blood pressure in dangerous territory, the baby's position a concern, the doctors speaking in the kind of measured tones that meant they were worried but didn't want to trigger panic. And Celeste had transferred her access from the house to the hospital corridor. The nurses noticed things. Nurse Camilla Reyes noticed them first. She'd been working the private ward for 9 years, and she had a kind of professional attentiveness that was less about protocol and more about the fact that she was, at her core, someone who paid attention to people. She noticed that Seraphina's readings, blood pressure, heart rate, the secondary markers that pointed toward stress, consistently elevated in the hours after Celeste's visits. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and say, look, this number went up because of that woman, but consistently. Every visit within 2 hours, the numbers climbed. She also noticed that Seraphina never cried in front of anyone. This was, to Camilla, a more significant data point than the monitors. The women on this ward who were genuinely okay cried sometimes, from pain, from fear, from the ordinary overwhelming enormity of what their bodies were doing. The women who were holding themselves together with an act of sustained will did not cry. They stared at ceilings. They asked very precise questions. They thanked you too carefully for every small service. Seraphina thanked her too carefully. Camilla started staying a few minutes longer on her rounds. Seraphina started talking. Not about Celeste directly, not about Dante directly. She talked, in the sideways manner of someone who has learned not to make direct accusations, about the strange sensation of being the most peripheral person in your own life, about loving someone so much that you started doing the emotional labor of protecting them from the knowledge of how much they were failing you, about the particular exhaustion of carrying a secret that would save someone who didn't know they needed saving. Camilla listened. On the 15th day of Seraphina's hospitalization, Dante visited. This was itself notable. He had come twice before. Briefly, businesslike, trailing 2 men who waited outside and checking his phone twice in the 11 minutes he stayed. This third visit was different in no visible way, except that Seraphina, when she saw him in the doorway, reached toward him with a rawness that Camilla caught from across the room and looked away from, because it was the kind of thing that wasn't meant to be witnessed. Dante. Seraphina's voice was quiet. Not weak. She had never been weak, but worn down to something essential, the way stone gets worn by water. Please stay. Just stay tonight. He had come to her bedside. He had held her hand for a moment. He had, and this was the part that Camilla would think about later, in the ugly clarity of hindsight, looked at his phone. There's a situation I need to handle. There's always a situation. Seraphina, I know. She had not argued. This was the thing. She had not argued. Go handle it. He had kissed her forehead, the same gesture as the kitchen on the Tuesday morning she'd told him about the pregnancy, and walked to the door. She had watched him go with the expression of someone who was measuring the exact distance between where they were and where they had expected to be by now. From the doorway, he had stopped. She had thought, for one unguarded second, that he was going to turn around. He didn't. What he said, to the threshold rather than to her, was, I'll come back tomorrow. He hadn't. Celeste had come instead. This was the visit where everything accelerated. It was late afternoon, that low-light hour when the ward was quiet and the day staff was transitioning, and the particular looseness of shift change meant that no one was watching as carefully as they should have been. Celeste had arrived with the ease of someone who had been here often enough to move without friction. The nurses at the desk knew her face. She wore her authority like a physical object. She moved through that hospital the way Dante moved through every room he entered, as though departure was the only thing requiring permission. She had closed the door behind her. Seraphina was sitting up in bed, the fetal monitor wrapped around her, the soft rhythmic sound of their child's heartbeat the only noise in the room. She watched Celeste cross the room and felt that animal certainty again, sharper this time, the way a sound you couldn't quite name gets clear right before it becomes something you can't unhear. You look exhausted, Celeste said. I'm fine. You're not. Celeste sat down, not in the chair beside the bed, where visitors sat, but at the foot of it, which was a thing no visitor did, and which Celeste knew perfectly well. He's not coming back, you know, not the way you want him to. Seraphina didn't answer. He's talked to me about the pregnancy, about what it's costing him operationally, having you here, the worry, the distraction. He doesn't say it in those words because he knows how it would sound, but what do you want, Celeste? The directness landed in the room like a dropped weight. Celeste paused. She reset her expression with the speed of someone practiced at it. I want what's best for Dante. No. Seraphina held her gaze. You want what's best for Celeste. Those are different things. Dante doesn't know that yet, but I do. Something shifted behind Celeste's eyes. Seraphina reached for the folder on her bedside table. She had been building it slowly, carefully, over weeks. Copies of financial records that had come through her hands in the months before her hospitalization, internal communications she had photographed on her phone, dates and figures and transfers that, assembled in sequence, described exactly what Celeste had been doing with her access to Dante's accounts and her access to Dante's ear. She held it out. I know what you've been doing. I have the evidence. You can walk out of here right now, and I'll give this to Dante directly. Or, she didn't finish the sentence. Celeste looked at the folder. Then she looked at the belt looped through her coat, and Seraphina understood, in the half-second before it happened, that she had made a miscalculation. She had assumed that Celeste was intelligent enough to know when she was beaten. She had not fully accounted for the particular danger of a person who has built everything on access to power, who has spent years threading herself through someone else's empire and made it the total architecture of her identity, confronted with the moment of its removal. Celeste was not intelligent about this. Celeste was cornered. The belt came free from the coat loops. Seraphina had one hand on the call button and one hand wrapped around her stomach, and no time for either. The first strike landed on her forearm, the one reaching for the call button, with the flat of the leather. Not the buckle. The flat. Deliberate, Seraphina registered through the shock of pain. She's not trying to kill me. She's trying to terrify me. She wants the folder. She did not let go of the folder. The second strike caught her shoulder and she curled inward, the monitor wires pulling taut, the fetal monitor slipping, and the machine beside her began alarming with the particular urgency that cardiac and fetal monitors used for one purpose only. The third strike hit the side of her face. That was when the door opened. Camilla Reyes had been 3 rooms down when the first alarm registered on the ward monitor board. She had moved toward it with professional speed and hit the door of Seraphina's room without knocking because when a fetal alarm was going off, you did not knock. What she saw stopped her for exactly the half second it took her brain to process it. A woman, mid-swing with a belt, a pregnant patient curled around her stomach, blood on the pillow from a split lip. And then she was across the room with a speed that surprised her and had her hand locked around Celeste's wrist before the fourth strike could land. "Get out," Camilla said. Her voice was completely flat. Years of training and the particular steeliness of a woman who had watched a lot of terrible things had reduced this moment to a single operational sentence. Celeste looked at her. "Get out of this room," Camilla said. "Right now, or I call security and you explain to them what happened to that belt." Celeste looked at Seraphina. Seraphina looked back. She was still holding the folder. Celeste left. Camilla locked the door, a rule violation she was prepared to justify, and was at Seraphina's bedside in the next breath, running the rapid assessment that 9 years of ward nursing had made automatic: pupils, lips, vitals, fetal monitor readout, the forearm with its red wheel rising, the shoulder, the cut at the cheekbone from the belt's edge. "I need to call," Camilla started. "Not Dante." Seraphina's voice was completely steady in a way that was scarier than shaking would have been. "He won't answer, and if he does, she'll know within the hour, and she'll change everything." She pressed the folder against her chest. "I need you to keep this safe, and I need you to get me paper and a pen." Camilla looked at her. "Please," Seraphina said. So Camilla got the paper, and she stood outside the door while Seraphina, with a cut on her face and welts rising on her arm and her unborn child's heartbeat still alarming softly on the monitor, wrote the letter. It was not a long letter. Seraphina was not a woman who needed many words for the things that mattered. She wrote one sentence for everything she needed Dante to know. She sealed the envelope and wrote his name on it and handed it to Camilla and said, "When the time comes, you'll know when." Camilla took the envelope. She also called the head of hospital security and reported what had occurred, because she was a nurse who could be compassionate and strategic at the same time. She filed the incident report in the way that ensured it existed in writing, with timestamps, in a system Celeste did not have access to. She was thorough and methodical, and when she was done, she went back to Seraphina's room and sat in the chair beside the bed, the visitor's chair, the right chair, and said nothing. Because sometimes what a person needed was for someone to simply be present without requiring anything from them. That night, Seraphina's blood pressure entered dangerous territory. The attending physician, Dr. Reyes Okafor, a composed man of 52 who had delivered approximately 2,000 children and who had, in that time, developed an accurate instinct for which situations would become crises, reviewed her readings at 11 and made 2 decisions. He increased her medication, and he moved her to the high-risk monitoring suite. He also called Dante Moretti's direct number. Dante didn't answer. He left a message. The message said, "Mr. Moretti, this is Dr. Okafor at Meridian Private Hospital. Your wife's condition has deteriorated. I need to discuss her care with you. Please call back immediately." Dante was in a meeting that Celeste had told him was critical, a negotiation with representatives of the Valdez faction that had been building for 3 weeks and which, she had impressed upon him, could not be postponed. She had delivered this information with her usual precise urgency. She had also, in the previous 48 hours, told Dante, carefully, obliquely, in the manner of someone sharing a concern they'd rather not share, that Seraphina had been asking hospital staff about Dante's financial accounts, had been making calls, had been asking questions that seemed, to Celeste, less like the concerns of a worried wife and more like the behavior of someone building a case. Dante had sat with that. He was not a stupid man, but he was a man who had spent his entire adult life in an environment where everyone wanted something from him and where the safest assumption was always the most offensive one. He had been burned by trust. He had been reached through affection before, in the years before Seraphina, by people who had understood that the way to a controlled man was through whatever he could not control in himself. He had not thought Seraphina was that person. But Celeste was consistent. She was precise. She cited specifics he couldn't immediately disprove. And she had been, or appeared to have been, loyal for 4 years in a world where loyalty had a street value. He let the call from Dr. Okafor go to voicemail. He finished the meeting. He poured himself a drink in the silence after the men left, and stood at the window of the building he operated from and looked at the city below and felt, beneath the controlled surface of the man he performed constantly, the particular discomfort of someone who is avoiding a knowledge they already possess. He thought about the kitchen on the Tuesday morning. He thought about his wife's hand reaching toward him in the hospital room. He thought about the way she had said, "I know," when he told her he had to leave, and what it had done to him, that I know. The lack of fight in it, the resignation, the careful way she'd released him rather than held on. He did not think about what he was choosing. He was very good at not thinking about what he was choosing. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a hospital number he didn't recognize, a different extension than Dr. Okafor's. He stared at it, thought about Celeste's warnings about Seraphina and her investigations, thought about the Valdez negotiation and the 6 other fires he was managing and the weight of the organization that sat on his decisions daily. He sent the call to voicemail. He went home. The house was quiet in the way that houses get quiet when the person who made them a home is absent. He noticed this without acknowledging it. He poured a second drink. He sat in the chair in the study where he did his thinking, and he put his elbows on his knees and he looked at the floor for a long time. On the bedside table in the high-risk suite at Meridian Private Hospital, the envelope with his name on it sat beside a glass of water, and a small photograph of a Tuesday morning kitchen that Seraphina had taken on her phone without him knowing. The two of them caught in an ordinary moment, the light unremarkable. His expression caught between whatever he'd been doing and her. His face caught in the half-second of looking at her. She told the nurse it was her favorite photograph. Not because they looked happy, because they looked real. Seraphina lay in the dark of the monitoring suite and listened to the sound of her child's heartbeat on the machine beside her, and pressed one hand flat against her stomach and stared at the ceiling, the way women stare at ceilings when they are deciding how much fight they have left. She had a lot of fight left. She was also very tired. She was 32 years old, and she had spent the last 7 months of a dangerous pregnancy managing a conspiracy, protecting a husband who didn't know she was protecting him, maintaining her composure against a woman who wanted her destroyed, and building a folder of evidence with shaking hands while lying in a hospital bed. She was tired, but she pressed her hand flat against the kick that came, the small decisive movement of a child who was already, in all the ways that mattered, fighting alongside her. "I know," she said softly, to the dark, to the heartbeat, to whatever was listening. I know, I'm not done." Outside in the corridor, Camila Reyes finished her shift report and checked on the monitoring suite one last time before handing off to the night staff. She looked at Seraphina through the glass panel in the door, lying still, hand on her stomach, eyes open, and felt the thing she sometimes felt at the end of a shift that had contained something she would not easily forget. She thought about the envelope. She thought, when the time comes, you'll know when. She went home. The night stretched. At 3:47 in the morning, Seraphina's blood pressure crossed the threshold that Dr. Okafor had specifically marked as the point requiring immediate intervention. The night staff moved fast. The call to Dante Moretti's number was placed at 3:51. This time, somebody answered. The man who answered Dante Moretti's phone at 3:51 in the morning was not Dante. It was Marco Testa, Dante's head of security, a thick-necked Sicilian-American who had been with the organization for 11 years and who slept on a cot in the anteroom of Dante's residence during high-threat periods, which this qualified as. Marco had standing instructions to screen calls after midnight and wake Dante only for a defined list of situations. A hospital was not on that list. Celeste had revised the list 3 weeks ago. Marco took the message, "Critical deterioration, Dr. Okafor, call back immediately," wrote it on the notepad he kept beside the cot, and set it on the kitchen counter where Dante would see it in the morning. He did this correctly, by the protocol he'd been given. He went back to sleep. The protocol had been revised by Celeste. Marco did not know that. At 4:11, Seraphina's blood pressure spiked hard enough that Dr. Okafor was pulled from his on-call room and appeared in the monitoring suite in the particular controlled urgency of a doctor who has already mentally triaged the situation before he's fully dressed. He reviewed the readings. He spoke to the night nurse in low, specific sentences. He looked through the glass at Seraphina, who was awake, had been awake since 3, was watching him read her chart with the steady attention of someone determined to understand exactly what was happening to their body. And he went in. Your blood pressure is at a level I'm not comfortable managing conservatively, he said. He sat down because he was the kind of doctor who sat down, who had learned that this was the difference between a patient who heard you and a patient who panicked. We're going to increase intervention. I want to discuss with you what the next 12 hours might look like. Is the baby in danger? Not a question. The way she said it made it not a question. The baby is currently stable. Our goal is to keep it that way. And me. He held her gaze. You're in the right place. We're going to take care of you. Seraphina accepted this with the particular dignity of someone who recognized when they were being protected from the full version of information and had decided, this once, to accept the protection. I want my husband called again. We called at 3:51. There was no call again. Her voice didn't rise. It just became absolutely unignorable. Different number, I'll give you a direct cell. She gave him a number that was not in any official record. A number Dante had given her in the first year of their marriage for emergencies. A phone he kept separate from everything operational. Dr. Okafor called it himself. It rang 7 times. Dante answered on the 7th ring, the way people answer calls in the deep of the night. Disoriented, voice scraped, the defensive reflex of sleep interrupted by something the body already knows is wrong before the brain catches up. Who is this? Mr. Moretti, this is Dr. Reyes Okafor. I am your wife's attending physician at Meridian Private Hospital. I need you to listen to me carefully. A pause. Fabric moving, Asan. He was sitting up. What happened? Your wife's condition has deteriorated significantly over the past 3 hours. Her blood pressure is at a dangerous level, and we are managing an active complication that places both her and the baby at elevated risk. I need you here. Now. Not in the morning. Now. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. Is she conscious? She's awake. She asked us to call you. Another pause. Dante's breathing was audible. The specific rhythm of a man running rapid calculations inside a silence he was maintaining on the outside. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 14. Camila Reyes, back for the early morning shift an hour ahead of schedule because she had not been able to sleep, was at the nurse's station when Dante Moretti came through the ward doors. She had seen powerful men move through spaces before. Hospital wards had a particular quality: the enforced vulnerability of illness, the institutional neutrality of the environment, that tended to reduce every person to their actual human scale. She had seen company executives in $3,000 suits lose all authority the moment they walked into a hospital room where someone they loved was sick. Dante did not lose authority. He moved through the ward like something with mass and velocity that the environment was simply accommodating. 2 men she had not seen before were with him. They stopped at the ward entrance, correctly, responding to a look from the desk nurse that Dante apparently communicated wordlessly to them. He came alone down the corridor. His face was, she would think about this later, the word for it. It was stripped. Like whatever he normally wore on the outside of himself had not had time to be put back on at 14 minutes and 3 in the morning. He looked exactly his age for the first time since she'd seen him. He looked like a man who was afraid and was not performing anything about it. Room? He said at the nurse's station. Camilla told him. He went. She followed at a professional distance. She had legitimate reasons to check the monitoring suite, and stood at the corridor angle where she could see the glass panel of the room without being visible inside it. Dante stood in the doorway for a moment. Seraphina turned her head and looked at him. What moved across her face was too complicated to name. It was not relief, or not only relief. It was the particular expression of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just seen the possibility of putting it down, but can't put it down yet, because the thing is still heavy and the moment is not yet safe. Dante crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the chair beside her bed. He looked at her arm. The wheal was still visible. The bruising had developed in the hours since, a dark, irregular stripe across her forearm. He looked at the cut at her cheekbone. His jaw tightened. Who did that? Seraphina looked at him. Seraphina, who did that? You should talk to the doctor, she said. He wants to explain what's happening medically. That's the important... The doctor can wait 2 minutes. His voice was completely controlled and completely dangerous, the way very still water could be completely dangerous. and his eyes had not moved from the bruise on her arm. Who? Dante. Who? She held his gaze. And then, because she was exhausted and because he was finally here, and because the folder was on the bedside table 6 inches from his hand, she said, Celeste. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, not the silence of disbelief, something more unsettling than that. The silence of a man who has heard a thing that detonates against information he was already carrying and doesn't want to look at what the collision produced. That's not... He stopped. It's in the folder, Seraphina said. On the table. I've been building it for 2 months. Financial records, communication logs, dates, and amounts. She kept her voice level because she had rehearsed this moment, had rehearsed the version of it where he was ready to hear it, and the version where he wasn't, and had decided that either way she would be calm. She's been redirecting accounts, small amounts, consistently, into a holding structure that connects to the Valdez family's financial network. She's been feeding them operational information. The deal that fell through in September, the location breach in October, she orchestrated both. Dante had not moved. She's been positioning you for a war, Seraphina said, with a faction she has a private arrangement with, and she's been using your trust in her to make sure you were looking the wrong direction while it happened. A breath. She told you I was the threat. I was the one you needed to be watching, because if you were watching me, you weren't watching her. The monitor beside her beeped with steady patience. Dante reached for the folder. His hands, Seraphina noticed, were not entirely steady. He opened it. He looked at the first page, the second. He turned pages with the focused attention of someone reading something they are also simultaneously not wanting to be real. His face changed in increments, not with surprise, she realized. He was not surprised. He was confirming. I was looking at documented evidence of something that some part of him had already registered in the gap between what Celeste said and what the results were, and had filed in the category of things that were easier not to examine. How long have you had this? He said. 6 weeks. His eyes came up. I tried to tell you, Seraphina said. You didn't answer. The machines beeped. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. Dante looked at his wife, at the bruise on her arm, the cut on her face, the monitors wrapped around her, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of weeks of insufficient sleep, and the absolute unbroken composure of a woman who had done all of this while carrying his child in a dangerous pregnancy without a single person from his organization standing beside her. And something happened in his expression that Camilla, watching from the corridor, could see even through the glass panel. Something broke open. Seraphina, get the doctor, she said quietly. Please, we need to talk about the baby. He got the doctor. Dr. Okafor explained the situation with the precision and gravity it deserved. The blood pressure was at a level indicating severe preeclampsia. The baby was at 30 weeks. If the mother's condition continued to deteriorate, they would face a decision about early delivery that carried its own serious risks. The next 12 to 24 hours were critical. He said all of this to Dante directly, with the eye contact he had deployed earlier in this story for exactly this purpose. And Dante received all of it with a stillness that was not calm. It was the stillness of someone absorbing impact. When the doctor left, Dante stayed. This was not nothing. He did not leave. He did not take a call. When his phone buzzed in his pocket, twice in the first hour, both from numbers Seraphina recognized from the organization. He looked at the screen and put it face down on his knee. Seraphina watched this. She watched him sit in the chair beside her with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fetal monitor, watching the line that represented their child's heartbeat. And she thought about 6 years of learning his language, and she thought, he is trying. She also thought, this is not enough, and it is too late, and it may be all we get. She held both of these things at once because she had always been able to hold contradictions. It was the people who couldn't hold contradictions who got broken by them. At 6:15 in the morning, his phone buzzed again. He ignored it. At 6:40, Marco Testa appeared at the ward entrance. Camilla saw him before Dante did, the thick-necked man in the dark coat who moved with the particular attention of security personnel and who, when he spotted the nurse's station, came directly toward it with the specific energy of someone carrying information they've been told is urgent. I need to speak with Mr. Moretti, Marco said. This is a restricted ward, Camilla said. Immediate family only. I understand. I need 1 minute with him. It's operational. Camilla went to the monitoring suite. She knocked. She always knocked. It was the only rule she had not bent in 9 years. And told Dante there was a man asking for him. Dante came out. Marco spoke to him in the corridor in a voice pitched low enough that Camilla, at the nurse's station, caught only the shape of it. Not words, tone. She watched Dante's face while Marco talked. Watched the control come back across it, the executive machinery reasserting itself over the stripped human thing she'd seen walk through those ward doors 40 minutes ago. Watched him become, in increments, the man the organization required. How long? Dante said. It started an hour ago, Marco said. They hit the West Side Depot. 3 of ours are down. Castellano is saying it's a direct response to the Valdez. It's not Valdez, Dante said. Marco stopped. It's not Valdez, Dante said again, slower, processing while speaking. It's designed to look like Valdez. Pull everyone back from the depot. Don't retaliate. I want Castellano in a room with me in 2 hours. 2 hours, yes. And, Marco hesitated. Celeste is trying to reach you. She says it's urgent. She says you need to authorize a response to the West Side. Tell Celeste, Dante said, and his voice dropped to something that was barely volume at all, that I am aware of the situation. Marco looked at him. Tell her I'll be in touch. He turned back toward the ward. And Marco. Yes. Who revised the overnight call protocol? Marco frowned. Celeste adjusted it about 3 weeks ago. She said you'd approved the new... I didn't approve it. Dante's voice was completely flat. Go. Marco went. Dante returned to the monitoring suite. He sat back down. Seraphina had not been asleep. He could tell from the way her eyes came to him too quickly, the monitoring of someone who had trained herself not to show she was monitoring. He sat down and put his phone face down on his knee again and looked at the fetal monitor and said nothing for almost a minute. Then, the depot on West Side was hit. I heard, Seraphina said. It's meant to look like Valdez. I know. It's in the folder, pages 9 and 10. She's been building a provocation scenario for 6 weeks, designed to trigger a response from you that would give the Valdez faction legitimate justification to move against your Eastern operations. She paused. She needed you angry and certain and acting fast. That's why the timing on this is... She knows you're here. She knows you have the folder. This is her moving the clock. Dante looked at his wife. She is not stupid, Seraphina said. She knew there was a chance I would eventually get this to you. She built the endgame to work even if you believed me. She just needs you to be in a room with Castellano instead of here. I need to handle... I know you do. Seraphina's voice didn't crack. It was the steadiest thing in the room. I know. He stood. She didn't reach for him. This time, she didn't reach for him. He noticed. He stood at the door and looked back at her, and she met his eyes with an expression that contained absolutely no demand, no accusation, no plea, nothing to react against or argue with. Just a woman who had decided to stop spending herself on a man who kept choosing the door. Seraphina, go, she said. Handle your organization. I'll be here. It wasn't resignation this time. It was something quieter and more final. He left. The morning moved through the ward with its ordinary rhythms, breakfast trolleys, medication rounds, the day staff arriving with coffee and conversation, and the particular energy of people starting rather than finishing. Camilla stayed past her shift again. She told herself it was paperwork. She sat at the nurse's station and did paperwork and watched the monitoring suite and waited for she didn't know what. At 9:20, Celeste Varon appeared at the ward entrance. Camilla was on her feet before Celeste reached the station. This ward is restricted, Camilla said. Immediate family only. I'm here to see Seraphina. Celeste's voice was its usual composed register, but there was something under it today. A frequency that Camilla recognized as the particular vibration of a person under serious pressure who is performing the appearance of a person who is not. Immediate family only, Camilla said again. She held Celeste's gaze without blinking. No exceptions. Celeste looked past her toward the corridor. I have authorization from Mr. Moretti's organization. Yes, Camilla nodded. Which is not a hospital authority and does not supersede ward policy. She let a beat pass. There's also a security incident on record in this ward from yesterday. If you'd like to discuss that, I'm happy to connect you with hospital administration. Otherwise, Celeste left. She did not leave gracefully. The exit was controlled. Celeste Veron could not do ungraceful. But there was a speed to it, a fractional tightening of her shoulders, that told Camilla the ground was moving under her. Camilla went back to Seraphina's room. "She came," Seraphina said. She had been watching the door. "She's gone." "She won't stay gone." Seraphina looked at the ceiling. "She's realizing the clock is running. She came here to see if Dante was still here and whether I'd given him the folder." "He took the folder with him." Seraphina nodded. Her hand moved to her stomach, the reflexive gesture of a woman who had made that movement so many times it had become continuous. "Has the doctor been in?" "He'll be here at 10. "Okay." A breath. "Okay." Camilla sat down. "Can I ask you something?" Seraphina said. "Yes." "When you found her in here?" "Yesterday." She didn't say with the belt. They both knew what she meant. "What did you think?" Camilla considered the question. "I thought she was desperate," she said honestly. "Desperate people are more dangerous than calculated ones. Calculated people have plans. Desperate people have nothing to lose." Seraphina's eyes moved to the window. "Yes." Outside Dante's operational headquarters, in a meeting room that smelled of cigarettes and old coffee and the particular staleness of a space where serious men had spent serious hours, Dante sat across from Nico Castellano, his chief enforcer, a 45-year-old Roman who had been with the organization since before Dante inherited it, and put the folder on the table between them. He turned to page 9. He said, "Tell me what you know about Celeste and the Valdez network." Castellano looked at the page. His face did something complicated. "Nico," Dante said. "Don't calculate. Calculate. Just tell me." "I've had suspicions," Castellano said. He said it like a man walking carefully across uncertain ground. "For about 4 months. The timing on the September deal was too precise. Only 6 people knew the location, and 5 of them I'd stake my life on. The 6th was Celeste." "You said nothing." "I said nothing because—" Castellano stopped. He looked at Dante with the expression of a man who is about to say something honest to a person with the power to punish honesty. "Because every time I moved toward raising it, something else came up. An emergency. A crisis. A reason for me to be looking somewhere else." He tapped the page. "Looking at this, I'd say those emergencies were not coincidences." Dante looked at the financial records. Seraphina's handwriting in the margins. Small, precise annotations connecting transfers to dates. Dates to events. Events to outcomes. 6 weeks of work. Conducted from a hospital bed. By a woman he had decided was a distraction. He put his thumb over her handwriting for a moment. Then he pulled it away. "The West Side hit," Dante said. "Who executed it?" "We don't have—" "It was contracted," Dante said. "Look at page 12. Castellano turned to page 12. He read. His jaw set. "She contracted it through a shell entity," Dante said. "One that would trace back to Valdez with enough surface investigation to confirm what she wanted me to believe. She needed me furious and certain, and in a room authorizing a response." He looked at Castellano. "She needed me not in a hospital." The room was very quiet. "I need to know," Dante said, "who in this organization has been feeding her information, not who she manipulated passively, who actively cooperated. I need names, and I need documentation, and I need it in my hands before tonight." "And Celeste?" Dante was quiet for a long moment. "Celeste is not to be approached. Not yet. If she runs, we lose the network she built. I need to understand the full architecture before anything moves." He stood. "Get me the names." He drove back to the hospital. He was not performing anything this time. He was not calculating what his presence cost him or what the organization required. He drove back because somewhere between the folder and Castellano's face and page 12 of his wife's careful documentation, he had crossed a line inside himself that he hadn't known was there until he was past it. He parked. He took the elevator. He walked down the ward corridor. He could hear from the corridor the fetal monitor alarm, not the soft, steady beeping of a machine doing its job. The other sound, the one that meant something had changed. He ran. Camilla was already in the room. Dr. Okafor was 40 seconds behind him, arriving at the door as Dante reached Seraphina's bedside. She was conscious. She was gripping the bed rail. Her face was the color of something that scared him in a way that no threat, no weapon, no confrontation in 34 years of a life that had contained significant violence had ever scared him. "Stay with me," he said. He grabbed her hand. "Seraphina, stay with me." "I'm here," she said. Her grip on his hand was very strong. "I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Okafor was at the monitor, reading, speaking to Camilla in the low, urgent shorthand of medical professionals moving fast. He turned to Dante with the eyes of a man who has committed to honesty even when honesty is difficult. "Her pressure has crossed a threshold. We need to make a decision about delivery." "She's 30 weeks, Dante said. "Yes. That's too early. It's the risk we're weighing against the risk of what happens if we don't." The doctor's voice was completely level. "The baby's position is manageable. Seraphina's pressure is not manageable conservatively anymore. If we wait—" He stopped, restarted. "I need you both to understand what we're deciding." Seraphina looked at Dante. He looked at her. "What does she want?" Dante said to the doctor, but he was looking at Seraphina when he said it. "She knows," the doctor said. Seraphina's grip on Dante's hand tightened. "I want the baby safe," she said. "That's what I want." The doctor nodded. He looked at Dante. "Then we're doing this now," Dante said. Everything moved fast after that. The purposeful acceleration of a medical team, executing a plan, equipment, personnel, a preparation process that took 11 minutes, and which Dante stood through at Seraphina's bedside without moving, without speaking to anyone who wasn't her, without touching his phone once. She was looking at him with the careful evaluation of a woman who had spent 6 years learning to read a man who didn't want to be read. "You came back," she said. "I'm here," he said. "You left this morning and you came back." "I'm not leaving again." She looked at him for a moment that was longer than it should have been given what was happening in the room around them, and what she was looking for he couldn't name, but he felt examined in a way that went past his clothes and his money and his organization and found the specific man underneath all of it. The man who had walked out of this hospital room days ago while she held out her hand. The man who had sent calls to voicemail. The man who had let Celeste Veron write the story of his marriage while his wife fought that story alone from a hospital bed. "Seraphina," he said. His voice came out differently than he intended. Rougher, lower. "I'm sorry." She didn't respond. The preparation team was ready. They began moving her toward the operating suite. Dante held her hand until the threshold where they made him stop. She looked back once. Her face was composed and exhausted, and she looked at him the way people look at things they are not certain they will see again on the other side of something difficult. And the look said everything that the situation had left no time to say with words. The doors closed. Dante stood in the corridor. He was completely alone. Outside, the city moved through its morning with total indifference to the man standing in a hospital corridor, staring at a set of closed doors, holding a folder full of his wife's careful handwriting, and the accumulated evidence of every mistake he had made, and every warning he had ignored, and every time he had chosen the room full of men over the room with the woman who had been, without his knowledge, the only person in his entire organization who had ever actually been on his side. His phone buzzed. Celeste. He looked at the screen. He put the phone in his pocket without answering. He sat down in one of the chairs against the corridor wall. Plastic, uncomfortable, the kind of chair designed for waiting. And he put his elbows on his knees and he looked at the floor. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Dante Moretti had absolutely nothing to do but wait and live with what he'd done. The plastic chair was the hardest thing Dante Moretti had ever sat in. Not physically. He'd slept on concrete. He'd spent 72 hours in the back of a cargo truck once, crossing 3 borders in conditions that would have broken most men before the first checkpoint. The chair was nothing, but there was something about the enforced passivity of it, the absolute requirement that he sit and wait and do nothing while the only thing that mattered happened behind a door he couldn't open, that worked on him in a way that violence never had. Violence he understood. Violence had grammar. It had cause and response, and the specific satisfaction of a force meeting a counterforce. This was different. This was the particular helplessness of being removed from the equation entirely. Of being, for the first time in his adult life, irrelevant to the outcome. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and he counted the scuff marks on the linoleum And he did not think about what was happening behind the doors because thinking about it did nothing, and he had not yet learned how to do nothing. His phone buzzed 4 more times in the first hour. He did not look at it once. Camilla came out at the 40-minute mark. She was still in the operating suite scrubs, which told him she'd been pulled in to assist, which told him something about the complexity of what was happening behind the doors. She gave him what he recognized as the medically careful version of an update. Stable, proceeding, no information yet on the baby. She said it with the precision of someone who had been trained not to give false comfort and also not to create panic, and he received it with a nod, and she went back through the doors. He looked at the envelope in his hand. He hadn't realized he was holding it. Camilla had pressed it into his hand at some point. He couldn't reconstruct exactly when. The period between the doors closing and now had a compressed quality that made sequencing difficult. And he was sitting here with his wife's handwriting on the outside of it and the word Dante in her careful script, and he had not opened it. He turned it over, set it on his knee, turned it face down, then face up again. He opened it. The letter was 3 sentences. He read them twice. Then a third time, more slowly. The way you read something when the words are simple, but the weight behind them keeps stopping you. I never needed you to be the most powerful man in the city. I only needed you to be my husband. Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that I chose you, the real you, the one you hide, and I would choose him again. He folded the letter. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and pressed his palm flat over it for a moment. Then he took out his phone. He called Castellano. "Where are you?" he said when Castellano answered. "Headquarters. I've been pulling the financial records you flagged. Dante, what she built. It's bigger than the folder. The folder is the visible layer. Underneath it, tell me." She didn't just redirect accounts. She has a secondary structure, a separate entity, incorporated 18 months ago, under a name that has no surface connection to the organization. It holds, I'm still verifying the full amount, but conservatively, it holds approximately 40% of the reserve funds from the Eastern operations. A pause. She's been building an exit, not just a betrayal, an extraction. She was planning to take the money and let the Valdez conflict destroy whatever was left. Dante was quiet. Dante. Who helped her? His voice was very quiet. Not the quietness of someone keeping calm, the quietness of a very specific temperature. 3 people that I can confirm, 2 financial controllers, and Castellano stopped. Dante. Luca. Dante's hand tightened on the phone. Luca Ferro, 28 years old, had been with the organization since he was 19. Dante had personally mentored him, had moved him up through 3 levels of the structure in 4 years based on an instinct for loyalty that Dante had trusted completely, and which, it turned out, he had trusted incorrectly. "You're certain," Dante said. "The transfers have his authorization codes. He was the internal conduit. She needed someone with access to the operational accounts. And he..." Another stop. "He and Celeste have been in contact for 14 months. Personal contact, the kind that doesn't go through official channels." 14 months. Dante had promoted Luca 12 months ago. "Find him," Dante said. "Don't move on him yet. Find him and watch him and tell me where he is." He ended the call. He sat in the plastic chair in the hospital corridor and reassembled what he knew into its actual shape, stripped of the version Celeste had been feeding him for over a year. Celeste had arrived 4 years ago with credentials, competence, and the particular self-presentation of someone who understood power structures intuitively. She had made herself indispensable with the efficiency of someone executing a plan, not through dishonesty, initially. Dante had checked her background, her references, her history. She was genuinely capable. The first 2 years she had been, as far as anyone could verify, exactly what she appeared to be. Effective, loyal, discreet. The betrayal had not been there from the beginning. This was the part that was hardest to hold. She had been loyal. Then she had been offered something, money or protection or a future that the organization couldn't give her. And she had made a calculation, and the calculation had won. And once the calculation was made, she had been very good at it. She had spent 14 months building the architecture of her exit, and 2 years before that building the trust that made it possible. He had given her that trust. He had given it to her. And then, When his wife tried to show him what it was costing, he had dismissed his wife and protected the person spending it. The operating suite doors opened. Dante was on his feet before he decided to stand. Dr. Okafor came through them. His face was readable, Dante thought. Physicians were trained to neutralize their expressions, and this man was good at his job, but there were things the face did that training couldn't fully suppress. And Dante had spent 34 years reading faces for information that the speaker was trying to withhold, and what he read in Okafor's face in the 2 seconds before the man spoke was relief, exhaustion, and something that is not quite the worst. "The baby is alive," the doctor said. Dante's entire body went still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing himself. The involuntary stillness of a system absorbing something it hasn't processed yet. A boy, 2 pounds 14 ounces. He's small and his lungs need support, but he is alive and he is stable, and the team in the NICU is with him right now. Okafor looked at Dante with the directness he'd been using throughout. He will need time. He will need care. But he has a real chance. Dante was looking at the doctor's mouth, moving his eyes up to meet the doctor's eyes, processing. "And Seraphina," he said. The doctor's expression moved. "She's alive," Okafor said. "She lost significant blood. The delivery was complicated, and there were moments where..." He stopped, restarted, more carefully. "She is in recovery. She is not out of danger. The next 8 hours are critical for her. But she came through the procedure and she is fighting." Dante put his hand on the wall beside him. Not for support, or not entirely. It was a grounding gesture, the hand on the solid surface, the physical confirmation that he was standing in a real place, and this was a real conversation, and the information was real. "Can I see her?" "In approximately an hour, when she's been moved from recovery to the high-dependency suite." The doctor looked at him steadily. "Mr. Moretti, I want to say something to you." Dante met his eyes. "Your wife is a remarkable woman. She has been managing a level of physical and emotional stress in this hospital that would have broken most people. She has done it without complaint, without drama, and with more composure than I have seen from patients who were carrying a fraction of what she was carrying." He paused. "She asked about you every day. Every single day of the 16 days she was here before tonight, she asked if you had called." Another pause. "She never told the staff that you hadn't. She simply asked." Dante held the doctor's gaze. He did not look away. He didn't think he deserved to look away. "Thank you," he said. The doctor nodded and went back through the doors. Dante sat down again. He put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. Or he didn't cry in any way he could have named as crying. But something happened in the private architecture behind his hands, in the space between his palms and his face. That was not the controlled processing of information. It was something else. Something that had been building for 16 days of voicemails and unread messages, and a plastic chair, and a folder of his wife's handwriting, and a 3-sentence letter against his chest. And it moved through him now like weather through a space that had been sealed too long. He sat with it. He didn't perform anything about it. He sat with it until it had done what it needed to do, and then he took his hands from his face and looked at the corridor ceiling and breathed for a moment, and then he took out his phone and called Castellano again. "I want Celeste in a room," he said. "Not tonight. Not until I've seen my wife and my son and I know they are safe. But tomorrow. I want her in a room, and I want Luca there, and I want every person who touched her financial structure present, and I want the documents." He kept his voice completely even. "Can you have that ready?" "Yes," Castellano said. "Good." He ended the call. He waited. The hour was the longest of his life, and he spent it in the plastic chair doing nothing, which remained the hardest thing he had ever done. Camilla came for him at the 53-minute mark. She walked him to the high-dependency suite and stopped outside the door and said, with the directness he had come to recognize as her characteristic register, "She knows you're here. She's been asking since she came out of recovery." She held the door open. Dante went in. Seraphina was very pale. He had prepared himself, in the corridor, for what she would look like. He was not a man who avoided difficult realities as a rule, but the preparation and the actual sight of her were two different things. She was pale in the specific way of someone who has lost blood and is being brought back by transfusion and time, a kind of translucency that was wrong for her face, which was normally so present, so animated by the things moving behind it. The monitors were back. The IV lines were back, more of them now. There was a bruise on her jaw that he hadn't seen clearly in the urgency of earlier, and which now, in the quieter light of the recovery suite, was visible in its full extent. She was looking at him. Her eyes were completely clear. He crossed the room. He pulled the chair to the side of her bed. Not the foot of it, the side. The visitor's chair, the right chair. And he sat down and he looked at her, and he didn't say anything for a moment because the things that needed saying were too large for the opening of a sentence. "He's alive," she said. "He's alive." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "They say he has a real chance." Seraphina closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she looked at the ceiling first and then at Dante. And what was on her face was not happiness exactly. Too much had happened. They were both too exhausted. The air between them was too complicated for happiness. But something that was the structure underneath happiness, the thing that made happiness possible when the weight lifted enough to let it in. "What did you name him?" she said. "That's not... I wasn't going to name him without you." She looked at him. "Eli," she said quietly. "I had been thinking about Eli." He nodded. "Eli." She reached for his hand. He gave it. She held it with the grip of someone coming back from a far distance, orienting by the thing in her hand, and he held back without speaking, without asking for anything, just let her hold it for as long as she needed. Then her eyes closed. He sat with her hand in his until the grip softened with sleep and her breathing evened out and the monitors beeped in their steady patience and the room was as quiet as anything had been in a very long time. He sat there for 30 more minutes. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. 7 words. "She knows you have the folder." Running. He was on his feet before he'd processed it. He kept his wife's hand in his for one more second, carefully, so he didn't wake her, and then set it down gently on the blanket and stepped out of the room and called Castellano in the corridor. "She's running," he said. "What?" "Celeste. She knows. Someone tipped her. Find Luca right now." He heard Castellano moving, heard voices in the background, heard the specific organized chaos of a structure mobilizing. 30 seconds of this, and then Castellano came back on the line. "Luca's gone," Castellano said. "His apartment is clean. Personal items are missing. He left sometime in the last 2 hours." Dante stared at the wall. "She had a failsafe," he said. Not to Castellano. To himself. He had underestimated her. He had told himself he understood the architecture of her betrayal, and he had been wrong because she had built a level beneath the level he'd found, and probably a level beneath that one, and he had made the mistake of thinking the folder was the full picture when the folder was only what she had let Seraphina see. "She's not running blind," he said to Castellano. "She has a destination. She has money already moved. Not the 40% in the secondary structure. That's a decoy or a sacrifice. She'll write that off. She has something else. Something we haven't found yet." He was moving down the corridor as he spoke, thinking through the architecture, working backward from what he knew. The Valdez contact. She would need a reception point. Someone on the other end who could receive her and protect her from any response from us. He stopped walking. "Pull everything we have on the Valdez secondary contacts. Not the known ones, the peripheral ones. People 3 or 4 layers out, who have financial connections to both the Valdez network and to any entity Celeste has touched. That's, Dante, that's going to take time. Then start now." He went back to Seraphina's room. He stood in the doorway and looked at her sleeping in the pale hospital light with the monitors measuring her life in steady lines and graphs. And he made a decision that was not strategic. He was not leaving this room. He would work the problem from here. He would give Castellano everything he needed, and Castellano would work the problem externally, and Dante would remain in this room because Seraphina had asked him to stay. Not tonight, not in words, but in the entire architecture of the previous 16 days, in every unreturned call and closed door, and careful I know she had offered in place of the fight she deserved to have, and he was not leaving. He pulled the chair back to the bedside. He sat. He worked the phone in silence, in the dark, while his wife slept, building the case for Celeste's capture from a hospital room with a plastic chair and a folder of his wife's handwriting and the particular focused fury of a man who had just understood the full extent of what he'd let happen. At 2 in the morning, Castellano called back. I found the reception point, Castellano said. It's not Valdez directly. It's a man named Rourke, Irish-American, operates out of the Port District, has logistics connections to 3 of the Valdez satellite operations. He's been in contact with a numbered account that traces back to Celeste's secondary structure. A pause. She's not running out of the country. She's running to Rourke. She thinks we won't look that direction because Rourke has always been peripheral, below our attention threshold. Dante thought about this. She's right that we wouldn't normally look there, he said. She's wrong that normally applies right now. He stood up from the chair. He looked at Seraphina. He sat back down. I'm not moving on this personally. I need you to take Ferris and 2 others, and I need it done clean. No collateral, no exposure. The kind of operation that produces a person who can be questioned and documentation that can be used. He kept his voice very low. I want her breathing, and I want her in a room by morning. And Luca. Luca too. A beat. Luca especially. Castellano went to work. Dante put his phone face down on his knee. He looked at Seraphina. He looked at the bruise on her jaw, and the IV lines, and the paleness of her face, and the specific exhausted fragility of someone who had been fighting for months and had finally been allowed to stop fighting for a few hours, and was taking the rest with the absolute totality of a body that had run itself to its limit. He thought about 14 months of Celeste's work, about the September deal and the October breach and the West Side Depot and the overnight protocol revision and every carefully engineered crisis that had occupied him at exactly the moment Seraphina had needed him present. He thought about how many times he had chosen the room full of men. He thought about the kitchen on the Tuesday morning. He thought about Eli, 2 pounds 14 ounces, lungs that needed help, a real chance, in a NICU 2 floors up in this same building, in an incubator with monitoring equipment and a team of specialists and the total indifferent professionalism of a system designed to bring small, early lives through the danger. He had not seen his son yet. He sat with this. At 3:40 in this morning, Seraphina opened her eyes. She looked at him without the lag of confusion. She had not been asleep long enough to be disoriented, or perhaps she had simply been aware of him even in sleep, the way people stayed aware in their periphery of the things that mattered. You're still here, she said. I'm still here. She looked at the dark window. What time is it? Late? Early? It doesn't matter. A silence. Have you seen him? She asked. Not yet. I wanted to be here when you woke up. She turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were doing the evaluation again, the reading of the man beneath the performance, and he let her read. He had nothing left to perform. The performance was expensive, and the thing it had been protecting had turned out not to be worth the price. There's something you're not telling me, she said. He held her gaze. She's running, he said. Celeste. She found out I have the folder and she's running. He watched her face. I have people handling it. She won't get far. Seraphina absorbed this. And Luca. He paused. You knew about Luca. I suspected. Page 11 of the folder. The authorization pattern. She closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. Dante, there's something else. Something I didn't put in the folder because I wasn't certain. I didn't have the documentation. I only had the inference. He leaned forward slightly. She didn't build this alone, Seraphina said. I mean, I know she had Luca. I know she had the financial controllers. But the original introduction, the connection to the Valdez network, someone inside your organization made that introduction before Celeste had enough access to make it herself. She looked at him. Someone who has been with you longer than Celeste. Someone with enough standing to open that door. The room was very quiet. Who? Dante said. Seraphina looked at him with the expression of a woman who is about to say something that she has been holding carefully for a long time, and who knows that the saying of it will change something between them permanently, and who has decided that the truth is worth that cost. Your father's consigliere, she said, retired, Moreno. Dante did not move. He introduced Celeste to the organization, Seraphina said. I know you know that. He vouched for her. You told me that when I first asked about her background. What I don't think you know is that the vouching wasn't neutral. He had a prior relationship with the Valdez network, from before your father's time, an old arrangement that was supposed to be dead. She watched him. It wasn't dead. It was dormant. And Celeste was how it came back. Dante stood up from the chair. He walked to the window. He put his hand on the glass and looked out at the city below, the dark and the lights and the specific early morning emptiness of streets that would fill again in a few hours, and that had no knowledge of anything that was happening in this room. Moreno. He had known Moreno for 30 years, since he was 4 years old. Moreno had sat at his father's table and at his table and had been at every significant event in the life of this organization for 3 decades. I was 71. He was supposed to be retired. He was supposed to be, of all the people in the full complex history of everything Dante had inherited, the one person whose loyalty was the bedrock beneath everything else. "How certain are you?" he said. His voice was very flat. "I found a wire transfer," Seraphina said, 6 weeks before Celeste arrived, from an account in Moreno's name, a personal account, not organization, to an entity that connects to the same financial structure she built. She paused. "It's not in the folder. I have it on my phone, in a file I encrypted." Dante turned from the window. "Your phone." "The passcode is Eli's due date," she said. "The date I told you about, 6/14. She held his eyes. "I'm sorry. I know what this means to you." He looked at her. He thought about 30 years. He thought about his father's table. He thought about a 4-year-old boy who had understood power primarily through the filter of a man with silver hair who explained things carefully and who had, for 3 decades, been the definition of someone you could trust. He went back to the chair. He sat. He picked up Seraphina's hand from the blanket, not the other way around this time, him picking up her hand, and he held it and looked at it and said nothing for a long moment. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "When you started building the folder, when you first understood what was happening," he looked up from her hand to her face, "you knew what it would cost you, what it would mean, telling me, what I might do." A pause. "Why did you do it?" She looked at him. "Because it was the truth," she said, "and you deserve to know it. Even after everything Yes. Quiet. Absolute. Even after." He held her hand. Outside the window, the city began its slow, early movement toward morning. A siren somewhere, far off. The particular shift of darkness that was not yet light but was no longer the deepest dark. Dante thought about Moreno. He thought about Celeste in whatever car was taking her toward whatever port or airfield or border she believed was her exit. He thought about Luca, who he had promoted and mentored, and who had taken that trust and sold it for 14 months of private contact with a woman who was using him. He thought about his son, 2 floors up, 2 pounds 14 ounces, fighting with the indifferent determination of someone who had not yet been told the odds. He thought about the man he had been for the past 16 days. And he understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has finally stopped lying to themselves, that the organization he would have to dismantle to get to the truth of this was not just the network Celeste had built inside his empire. It was the version of himself that had made her work possible, the one who answered to no one, the one who had learned to treat love as a liability, the one who had walked out of a hospital room while his wife held out her hand. That man had to be the one who didn't survive this. He tightened his grip on Seraphina's hand. She was already asleep again. He sat in the dark with the weight of 30 years of inherited loyalty that had just turned out to be a fiction, and the weight of his wife's 3-sentence letter against his chest, and the weight of an early son in an incubator 2 floors up, and he sat with all of it without trying to manage it into something smaller than it was. At 4:17 in the morning, Castellano sent a single message. "We have her." Dante read it. He did not respond immediately. He looked at Seraphina's sleeping face. He typed back, "Hold her. I'll be there in the morning. Don't start without me." He put the phone in his pocket. He leaned back in the chair. He closed his eyes. And in the incubator 2 floors up, Eli Moretti, 2 pounds 14 ounces, lungs working hard with assisted help, every system fighting toward the life that had not been easy to arrive at, moved his hand in the particular involuntary way of newborns, fingers spreading and closing against the air, reaching for something that wasn't there yet but that he seemed, in the way of very new things, entirely certain was coming. Dante left this hospital at 6:41 in the morning. He did not want to leave. That was the new reality he was operating inside of. A version of himself that did not want to leave, that had to be pulled away from a bedside by the gravitational force of unfinished business rather than the other way around. He stood in the doorway of Seraphina's room for a moment, looking at her sleeping face, at the slow rise and fall of her chest, at the monitors doing their patient work. And he made himself memorize it, not the way he used to memorize things, cataloging information for later use, but the way you memorize something you were afraid of losing. He went upstairs first. The NICU was on the 4th floor. He had not been there yet. He stood outside the unit doors and identified himself to the nurse at the desk, and she walked him in without ceremony, past the row of incubators, to the one at the far end where a plastic card read, "Baby Moretti, 30 weeks, day 1. He stood at the incubator glass. Eli was smaller than he had allowed himself to imagine. He had processed the medical facts. 2 pounds 14 ounces, premature lungs, real chance, as facts. The way he processed operational data, which meant he had understood them intellectually while keeping them at a managed distance from wherever he kept the things that were allowed to matter. Standing here with the glass between him and his son, the managed distance collapsed entirely. He was so small. He had his mother's forehead. That was the first coherent thought Dante managed. The particular shape of it, the quality of the skin. He had a shock of dark hair, and his hands. His hands were the size of things that shouldn't exist yet, things that belonged in a realm of incompletion, and they moved in the slow, random way of a body that was still learning. It had a body. The nurse said something about the breathing support and the feeding schedule and the progress targets, and Dante heard all of it and retained all of it and could not stop looking at his son's hands. He stayed for 11 minutes. Then he went. The drive to the warehouse district took 22 minutes through early morning streets. Castellano had the location, a holding facility that the organization used for exactly this kind of situation, a building with no official identity and very good soundproofing that had served its various purposes over the years, without ever appearing in any document that connected it to anything. Dante walked in at 7:19. The room they were using was in the back of the building, past the loading area and through a steel door. Ferris, a quiet, economical man who had handled sensitive operations for the organization for 8 years, was outside the door when Dante came through. "Both of them," Ferris said. "Not a question. Confirmation." Dante nodded. "Celeste first. Luca's in the secondary room." Dante went in. Celeste Veron was sitting in a metal chair with her wrists zip-tied in front of her. She had been brought in at approximately 4 in the morning. She had been sitting in the chair for 3 hours. She had not, according to Ferris's brief, said a single word since being placed in it, which was either composure or strategy, and probably both. She looked at Dante when he came through the door. He pulled a chair and set it directly in front of her and sat down so their eyes were level, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He was aware of Castellano behind him, and of Ferris at the door, and he was aware of his own breathing, which was controlled, and had been controlled, and even since the moment he walked into this building, because the thing he was feeling was not something he intended to do anything uncontrolled with. "You look tired," Celeste said. Her voice was exactly the same. That was the first thing. He had expected something, some crack, some frequency shift, some acknowledgement in her voice of what the night had been. There was nothing. She looked tired herself. Her hair was not immaculate. She had been wearing the same clothes for hours. There were shadows under her eyes. But her voice was the same precise instrument it had always been. "You had 14 months, Dante said. She held his gaze. "I want to understand something." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The same posture as the plastic chair in the hospital corridor. His hands were loose between his knees. "Not the money, not the Valdez arrangement. I understand those. I want to understand the decision to use my wife." He paused. "She was pregnant. She was in a hospital bed. You went in there and you hit her with a belt while she was carrying my child, and I want to understand what the thinking was." Celeste looked at him for a moment. "She had the folder," Celeste said. "So you hit a pregnant woman." "I needed the folder. You hit a pregnant woman in a hospital bed." His voice was still even. This was the most dangerous version of him, and everyone in the room knew it, except possibly Celeste, who knew it too but was performing not knowing it as her last available strategy. "With a belt, while she was connected to a fetal monitor." "It was a miscalculation," Celeste said. "I'm not—" She stopped. "You're not what?" "I'm not proud of it." Dante looked at her. "Okay," he said. He stood up. He picked up the chair, moved it to the side of the room, set it down quietly. He turned back to her. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to tell Castellano everything, not the version that protects the parts you think are still useful to you. Everything. The Valdez contact, the Moreno arrangement, the secondary financial structure, the names of every person who touched any part of what you built." He held her gaze. "You're going to do this completely, and you're going to do it now. And if I don't, then I give what we already have to people who have been looking for a reason to examine my organization's financial activities for some time, and I let them work out the rest themselves." He paused. "Which means they find you, and they find the money, and they find your arrangement with a family that has its own significant legal exposure, and the conversation you have about all of that happens in a context where I have no involvement and no motivation to help." He let that sit. "Or you talk to Castellano, and we handle this the way things get handled." Celeste's jaw moved. "Moreno," she said. "I know about Moreno." She blinked. "My wife is thorough," Dante said. "Was there anyone else at that level, or was Moreno the origin point?" A long pause. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, running probability assessments, determining how much he actually knew versus how much he was implying. He watched her reach the conclusion that he knew enough that holding back cost her more than it bought. "Moreno was the introduction," she said. "The original arrangement was his. I came in as the mechanism because he needed someone with active access and he was retired. We had a separate agreement. 30% of my extraction was his." What was his motivation? Old grudge. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who found other people's emotional motivations slightly tedious. Something from before your father consolidated the Eastern operations. Something Moreno felt he was owed that he was never paid. She shrugged, a small contained movement. He was patient. He spent 30 years being patient. Dante absorbed this. 30 years. A grievance 30 years old, maintained across 3 decades of apparent loyalty, dormant through everything. His father's death, the succession, the entire period of Dante's building of the organization, waiting with a patience that was almost architectural. "Where is he now?" Dante said. "I don't know." Celeste. "I genuinely don't know. We had a protocol. When the operation moved to extraction phase, we went to separate communications. I don't have his location." She looked at him. "That's the truth. It doesn't help you, but it's the truth." He believed her. He nodded to Castellano. He went to the secondary room. Luca Ferro was not sitting in his chair. He was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, and when Dante came through the door, his eyes moved to him with an expression that Dante recognized and had not expected. Shame. Not fear. Shame. The specific expression of a young man who has done something he cannot make fit with the version of himself he prefers. Dante stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. "You want to know why?" Luca said. "I want to know why." Luca uncrossed his arms. He put his hands in his pockets and then took them out again. He was 28, and he looked in this moment 22. That stripped-down age people sometimes reverted to under sufficient pressure. "She told me about the secondary structure in the 3rd month," Luca said. She positioned it as a security measure, something you'd approved but kept compartmentalized. She had documentation that looked..." He stopped. "It looked legitimate. I know that's not... I know." "When did you know it wasn't?" Luca was quiet. "Luca, when?" "About month 7. He looked at the floor. "By month 7, I understood what it was, what I was part of." And you continued. A silence that was its own answer. "She had documentation of my involvement from the first 3 months, Luca said. Things I'd signed, transfers I'd authorized believing they were legitimate. By month 7, I was implicated in something I couldn't extract from without..." He stopped again. "Without telling me," Dante said. Luca looked at him. "You were afraid to tell me," Dante said. "Yes." Dante looked at the young man he had promoted. He thought about 4 years of development, the patient work of identifying capacity and building it, the particular investment of time that went into turning someone raw into someone functional. He thought about what it cost him to do that work and what it meant that the person he'd done it for had chosen 7 months of silence over one honest conversation. "You should have told me," Dante said. His voice was not angry. This was worse. In month 7, you should have come to me. I know. I would have... Luca. He stopped, started again. I would have been angry. I would have been very angry, but I would have helped you get out of it. Luca's jaw worked. Instead, Dante said, you let it run for 7 more months. You let my wife spend weeks building a case from a hospital bed because she was the only person in this entire organization who was willing to come to me with the truth. He let this land. She was in a hospital bed with a dangerous pregnancy, and she was doing the work that you should have done. The room was very quiet. I know, Luca said. His voice was very small. Dante nodded. You're going to give Castellano everything, he said. Every authorization code, every document, every communication. You're going to help him rebuild the full picture of the financial structure from the inside. He moved toward the door, and then we're going to determine what happens next. But that is later. Right now we work the problem. He left Luca in the secondary room. He found Castellano in the loading area, on the phone, moving with the focused efficiency of a man executing a complex operation. Castellano ended the call when Dante approached. Moreno, Dante said. We're looking. He hasn't been at his residence since yesterday morning. His car is at his apartment. He has a property in the Lake District that we're... He's not in the Lake District. Dante thought about 30 years of knowing a careful man. 30 years of watching him operate. He has a boat. He's had it since before my father died. He talks about it the way men talk about things they actually plan to use someday. He looked at Castellano. Find the boat. Castellano was already on his phone. It took 24 minutes. The boat was registered under a name that was not Moreno's. A 3-step shell that would have taken a normal investigation weeks to trace, and which Castellano's team untangled in under half an hour, because they had Luca's access codes and the full financial architecture to work from. It was docked at a private marina 40 minutes south of the city. Dante went himself. He knew he shouldn't. He knew that sending Castellano and Ferris and staying removed was the operationally correct decision. It kept him at distance from direct action. It preserved the legal separation that his organization's survival sometimes depended on. It was the rational choice. He went himself. Because this was Moreno. Because 30 years demanded presence. They took 2 vehicles. Dante, Castellano, Ferris, and 2 others. The drive south was fast. Early morning light on highway, the city thinning into industrial periphery, and then the cleaner air and wider roads of the Lake District approach. Nobody spoke. Dante sat in the front passenger seat and watched the road and felt the particular focused clarity that preceded confrontations he'd been building toward for a long time. The marina was small, 20, maybe 25 slips, private. The kind of place where the other boat owners asked no questions because they valued not being asked any themselves. The harbor master was not present at this hour. The gate to the dock was not a serious obstacle. The boat was in slip 14. A 40-foot cruiser, old but maintained, the kind of vessel that moved easily and quietly and could cover significant water without requiring notable fuel stops if you planned the route correctly. There was a light on inside. Dante went down the dock alone. He had told Castellano to wait at the dock entrance, and Castellano had looked at him with the expression of a man who wanted to object, and had correctly assessed that objecting would not work. He waited at the entrance. Dante walked down the dock with the boards moving slightly under his weight and the water below making the soft percussion of water against hull, and he reached slip 14 and stepped aboard. He knocked on the cabin door. A long pause. Then the sound of movement inside. Slow. The movement of someone old getting up from wherever they'd been sitting, making their way to the door with the careful deliberateness of age. The door opened. Severo Moreno was 71 years old and had the appearance of a man who had lived most of his life in the careful maintenance of a particular image. Silver-haired, upright, the dignified elder of a world that had no official dignified elders. He had the face that Dante had looked to, as a boy, for signals about how to read difficult situations. The face that had been the most reliable weather instrument in his entire childhood. That face looked at him now. There was no surprise in it. I wondered if it would be you, Moreno said, or Castellano. Me, Dante said. Moreno stepped back from the door. Dante went in. The cabin was small and warm and smelled of coffee and the particular mustiness of a boat that was lived in occasionally. There was a bag on the table, packed, prepared. a passport, an envelope, the geometry of an exit. Dante stood in the cabin and looked at Moreno and waited. "Sit down," Moreno said. "I'll stand." Moreno sat. He sat in the chair beside the small table with the bag and the passport, and he put his hands flat on his thighs in the gesture of a man who has decided to be still. He looked at Dante with an expression that was complicated. Regret was in there, but underneath the regret, something harder, something that had been there for 30 years, apparently, underneath everything. "How much did she tell you?" Moreno said. "Enough. My wife told me the rest." Moreno was quiet for a moment. "Your wife," he said. She survived the delivery. My son is alive." Something moved across Moreno's face. Genuine relief, Dante assessed, which told him something about the scope of what Moreno had authorized and what he'd apparently told himself it wouldn't include. "You didn't know she'd go after Seraphina directly," Dante said. It wasn't a question. "No, that was—" Moreno stopped. "That was not part of anything I discussed or intended." "But you built the thing that put Seraphina in a room with a woman desperate enough to use a belt on a pregnant patient in a hospital bed." Dante's voice was flat. "You built the architecture. What happened inside it is yours." Moreno looked at the table. "Tell me about my father," Dante said. The old man's eyes came up. "Tell me what he did 30 years ago. What you believe he owed you." A long silence. "The Eastern Consolidation," Moreno said finally. 78, before you were born. Your father and I built those operations together. Not as employer and employee, as partners, equal architects. He said the word partners with a weight that told Dante it had been sitting in his chest for 30 years gathering density. When the consolidation succeeded, he restructured the organization. He brought in 2 of his cousins to run the Eastern operations, and he gave me the consigliere position. He paused. An advisory role. Prestigious. No equity. No percentage. You felt cheated. I was cheated. The old man's voice sharpened for the first time. Whatever word you choose for it, the arrangement we had was not honored. I built half of what he stood on, and I was given a title and a salary and access to a table where I sat without ownership. Dante looked at him. "So you spent 30 years at that table," Dante said, "and you shook my hand at my father's funeral, and you sat at my table, and you vouched for a woman you introduced as loyal." Moreno held his gaze. "Yes," the old man said. One word. The absolute flatness of it, no further justification, no appeal, just the acknowledgement, hit Dante differently than he'd expected. He'd expected something he could react to with fury. He'd prepared himself, on the drive down, for the version of this conversation that required him to manage his anger. What he hadn't prepared for was 30 years of compressed grievance delivered as a single syllable that contained its own exhausted dignity. "I can't give you back 30 years, Dante said. "Whatever my father did or didn't do, I can't return it. I know. And I can't ignore what you built inside my organization. I know that too." Dante looked at the bag on the table, the passport, the prepared exit. "Was the Valdez arrangement going to work?" he said. Moreno's chin lifted slightly. The financial extraction was real. The money Celeste moved was real. If the West Side provocation had landed the way she designed it, if you'd responded to what looked like a Valdez move and opened a conflict that would have consumed the organization for months, yes, the operation would have worked. "She underestimated my wife." "Yes." Moreno looked at him. "I told her not to underestimate your wife." This landed in the room, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You knew Seraphina was a risk to the operation," Dante said. "From the beginning. She sees things. She always saw things." The old man looked at his hands. "I told Celeste that Seraphina would find the threat eventually, and that she needed to be careful. I want to be clear, for whatever it's worth, I did not authorize what happened in that hospital room." "You authorized everything that made it possible," Dante said. "I was clear about that." Moreno nodded once. Dante picked up the passport from the table. He looked at it. The photograph. Moreno, 5 years younger, the silver hair neater, the face with less weight in it. A name that was not Moreno's. A careful exit built with the same patience as everything else. He put it back down. Here's what happens, Dante said. You're going to call whoever you need to call to access the Valdez connection, and you're going to communicate that the operation is finished, that the financial arrangement is terminated, and that any attempt to move against my organization based on the provocation scenario Celeste built will be met with the full disclosure of the arrangement to the relevant authorities, along with the documentation my wife compiled. He met Moreno's eyes. You're going to do this clearly and verifiably. Castellano will monitor the communication. Moreno looked at him. And then, Dante said, you're going to turn over every document, every account access, every communication record from the past 14 months. Everything. And after? Dante looked at the man who had sat at his father's table and at his table and who had bounced a 4-year-old boy on his knee in a kitchen 30 years ago that no longer existed. After, Dante said, is something we determine when the organization is stable, and my wife is well, and my son is out of the NICU, and I have the room inside my head to think about it clearly. He paused. That is not a kindness. It is the truth. I don't know what after looks like, and I won't decide it while I'm standing on a boat at 6 in the morning having this conversation. Moreno nodded. Something in the old man's posture released slightly. Not relief, not exactly. More the release of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has been told they can set it down, even if setting it down comes with consequences they can't yet see. Your wife, Moreno said. She's... Don't, Dante said. Quietly. Don't ask about her. Not right now. Moreno closed his mouth. Dante stepped back toward the cabin door. Call Castellano in, he said to Ferris without turning around. He stepped out onto the deck of the boat. He stood at the railing and looked out at the water, the early light on it, the still surface of the marina, the morning arriving without drama, the way mornings arrived regardless of what had happened in the dark before them. His hands were on the railing. He noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that was not fear, but the physical aftermath of sustained adrenaline finally finding nowhere useful to go. He gripped the railing until the tremor stopped. Behind him, in the cabin, he could hear Castellano's voice beginning the methodical work of documentation. Could hear Moreno responding. The machinery of accountability operating with the patient thoroughness that Castellano was good at. Dante looked at the water. He thought about Seraphina waking up in the high-dependency suite without him there. He thought about Eli's hands on the incubator glass. He thought about the plastic chair in the hospital corridor and the 3-sentence letter against his chest and the specific sound of operating suite doors closing while his wife looked back once. He took out his phone. He called the hospital. The ward nurse who answered told him that Mrs. Moretti had been awake since approximately 7, that her blood pressure was showing improvement, that she had asked twice whether her husband had been in touch. Tell her I'll be back by noon, Dante said. A pause from the nurse, then, I'll tell her. He stayed on the boat until Castellano had what he needed. This took 2 hours. Moreno was systematic. Dante would give him that. He gave the communication records in order. He walked Castellano through the financial architecture with the precision of someone who had built it carefully enough to take it apart carefully. There was a strange dignity to it, the dignity of a man paying a debt. Dante remained on the deck for most of it. At 9:40, Castellano came out. We have enough, Castellano said, more than enough. The documentation is complete. I've already sent the first files to... He stopped. Where do you want them to go? Dante had thought about this. The financial records go to the firm we use for the legitimate operations. They'll know what to do with them, what gets reported, what gets handled internally, what gets used as protection. He looked at Castellano. The surveillance records and the communication logs, those stay with you. I want them archived in a format that can be produced if anyone connected to the Valdez network tries to move on us in the next 3 years. And Celeste? She's already given you everything she has? Everything verifiable, yes. Then she goes to the authorities, Dante said, with the full documentation of the financial manipulation and the contracted provocation and the assault in the hospital. He held Castellano's eyes. I want the hospital incident documented specifically, with dates, medical records, Nurse Reyes's incident report. I want it in the file. Castellano nodded. The belt, Dante said. She hit my wife with a belt while she was hooked to a fetal monitor. His voice was completely flat. I want that in every document. I want there to be no version of what happens to Celeste Varon that doesn't start with that room. Understood. Moreno stays here until I tell you otherwise. 2 people with him at all times. Yes. Dante walked back up the dock. He got in the car. He sat in the passenger seat and the driver looked at him and waited. And Dante looked at the marina and the light on the water and the particular ordinary beauty of a morning that had no knowledge of what it had contained. Hospital, he said. The car moved. He closed his eyes for the first time in, he calculated, approximately 31 hours. Not sleep, just the dark behind his eyelids and the motion of the car and the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent a night and a morning doing things that could not be undone and making choices that pointed toward a version of himself he hadn't been before. He had Moreno. He had Celeste. He had the documentation. He had dismantled, in one morning, the architecture of a betrayal that had been building for longer than his son had been alive. What he did not have, what he could not extract from the marina or the warehouse or the pages of a folder, was the 16 days he had spent on the wrong side of a hospital door. The car moved through the city. He opened his eyes. He watched the streets he had controlled for 12 years moving past the window, and he thought about power, what it actually was, what it actually bought, what it failed to buy that he had not noticed failing because the things it failed to buy were not the things he'd thought worth measuring. His phone buzzed. Castellano. Luca's full deposition complete. Financial recovery estimate, 94% of the redirected funds. Celeste's transport to authorities, 11 a.m. He read it. He put the phone in his jacket pocket next to the letter. He felt the letter through the fabric, the small rectangle of it, 3 sentences, the weight of something that weighed almost nothing and contained everything. The hospital came into view. He got out before the car had fully stopped, a thing he hadn't done since he was young and impatient, and he was neither young nor impatient now. But the need to be inside that building was physical. It was muscular. It pulled him toward the entrance with a force that had nothing to do with strategy or control or the management of appearances. He went through the doors. He took the elevator. He walked down the corridor. He knocked on the door of the high-dependency suite. He always knocked now. It was a new habit. He had learned it from watching Camilla do it and understood that it was the correct behavior in a space that belonged to the person inside it. "Come in," Seraphina said. He went in. She was sitting up. The color was better. Not good, not what it should be, but better, visibly better than the terrifying translucency of last night. She had the blanket pulled up, and her hair was not immaculate because she had been in a hospital bed for weeks, and her hair was never going to be immaculate in those circumstances. And she looked, in the particular honesty of daylight, exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived something very hard and was beginning the process of understanding that she had survived it. She looked at him. He sat down in the chair. She examined his face with the careful attention he recognized as her reading of him, the real reading, the one that went past everything he presented. And she saw what she saw. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She nodded. A long breath. Her hand moved to her stomach. The reflex, still there, still the gesture of protection, even though the person it had been protecting was now 2 floors up in an incubator. And then she caught herself and let her hand rest on the blanket. "Moreno," she said. "Yes." "Are you—" She stopped. He knew what she was asking. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I don't know what I am about Moreno yet. I'm not ready to have that conversation inside my own head." He looked at her. "Is that—" "Yes," she said. "That's honest. That's fine." He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the letter and held it for a moment and then set it on the blanket between them. She looked at it. "I've read it 7 times, he said. She looked at him. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said. "I know that's not how it works, but I need you to know. I need you to know that I understand what I did. Not the version of understanding that's really just management. Actually understand." He held her gaze. "You protected me from people I trusted while I left you alone in a hospital. You built that folder from a hospital bed. You named our son before I even asked." His voice was doing the rough thing again. "I know what that cost you. I know what I cost you." Seraphina looked at him for a long time. The monitors beeped. The morning light moved through the window. "Have you seen him today?" she said. "Eli." "This morning, early." "And?" He looked at his hands. He's so small, he said. His voice came out unguarded entirely. He has your forehead. Something moved across Seraphina's face. Not forgiveness. They were nowhere near the conversation about forgiveness. They both knew that. There were months of hard, honest living between here and that conversation. But something that was the precondition for it. The acknowledgement that the man sitting in the chair was not performing anything, was not managing anything, was simply the specific damaged, imperfect human being she had chosen 6 years ago and had been trying to hold on to ever since. She reached out. He gave her his hand. She held it. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary morning, and in the NICU 2 floors up, Eli Moretti moved his impossibly small hands against the air of his incubator, and the monitors measured his progress in lines and numbers, and the morning continued its indifferent arrival into a day that was going to require, from everyone inside that hospital, the particular courage of people who have come through the worst of something and now have to figure out what comes next. Seraphina's grip on Dante's hand tightened. He held on. The holding came first, not words, not explanation, not the careful architecture of a conversation about what had happened and what it meant and what came next. Just the holding. Seraphina's hand in his, the monitors doing their patient work, the morning light moving in its slow arc across the floor of the high-dependency suite. Dante sat in the chair and held his wife's hand, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And this was, in its way, more honest than anything they could have said. There was a version of this moment that wanted to be a scene, that wanted speeches, declarations, the satisfying click of resolution. Neither of them gave it that. They were too tired and too real, and they had both, in their different ways, spent too much of themselves on performance to have any left for this. Seraphina slept again at 11. Dante sat with her until her breathing was fully even, and then he stood slowly and went upstairs to the NICU. He sat with Eli for 40 minutes. He did not touch him. The incubator glass was between them, and the nursing staff moved around him with their careful efficiency, and he sat in the chair they provided and watched his son breathe, watched the small chest rise and fall with the assisted rhythm of the breathing support, watched the monitors trace the evidence of a life that was working very hard at existing. The NICU nurse, a young woman named Tara with a steady, competent manner, told him that Eli's numbers were moving in the right direction. Cautiously optimistic, she said, "Early days but positive indicators." She said it with the particular precision of someone who had learned not to make promises and not to withhold hope. Dante nodded. He looked at his son's hands. At noon, he called Castellano. "Celeste," he said, "processed and transferred at 11:14. The assault documentation went with her. The hospital incident report, Nurse Reyes's statement, the medical records from that night." Castellano paused. "The detective handling intake asked me if we wanted to pursue it separately from the financial charges. I said we'd let the process work." "Good. The financial recovery is at 91%. The remaining 9% is in accounts that are frozen pending the legal process. It'll come back eventually. It'll just take time." "Fine." "Luca." Castellano said the name and then stopped because there was a question in it that he wasn't sure how to frame. "What did he give you?" "Everything. He was thorough. Dante, The deposition was complete. He didn't protect anything." Another pause. "He asked if he could send you something, a letter. I told him I'd ask." Dante was quiet. "Tell him yes," he said. He hung up. He went back downstairs. He sat outside Seraphina's room in a chair against the corridor wall. A different chair than the one outside the operating suite, but the same quality of discomfort, the same plastic institutional indifference. And he read the letter that Luca had apparently written while waiting for Castellano to come back to the secondary room. It was not a short letter. Luca was not a man who used few words. He was not, it turned out, a man who could summarize 19 months of entanglement and compromise, and the slow corrosion of a decision made in ignorance that became a decision made in knowledge that became a prison, in less than 4 pages of closely written text. He wrote with this particular urgency of someone who knew they were unlikely to get another opportunity. He wrote about the 3rd month and the 7th month and the specific moment. He named the day, he named the hour. When he had understood fully what he was part of, and had made the calculation that silence was safer than confession. He wrote, "I told myself that you wouldn't hear me, that you trusted her more than you'd trust me, and that coming to you would only make me the problem. I know now that I was protecting myself and telling myself it was caution. I know the difference. I knew the difference then. I didn't act on it. Dante folded the letter. He sat with it in his hands. He thought about the specific cruelty of Celeste's design. Not just the financial architecture, not just the Valdez arrangement, but the human architecture underneath it. She had understood that the way to build an operation inside a structure like his was not through external attack, but through the careful cultivation of internal failure. She had found Luca at the right age and in the right position. She had found Moreno carrying the right wound. She had found Dante in the right posture. A man who had built himself into someone who received loyalty as a given and stopped examining it. She had found all of them where they were weak. And she had been right about all of them. Dante was not a man who absolved himself easily. He had spent his adult life in an environment where excuses were the currency of people who couldn't afford accountability, and he had developed a contempt for excuses that applied to himself as strictly as to anyone else. He knew what he had done. He knew the specific architecture of his own failure, not as a man who had been deceived, which was true but partial, but as a man who had created the conditions in which the deception could operate. He had made himself unavailable to information that threatened his comfort. He had made his wife carry the weight of an empire's rot because he had decided, somewhere along the way, that protecting himself from needing her was the same as being strong. He sat with this. He did not try to process it into something more manageable. At 2 in the afternoon, Seraphina woke up and asked for water, and then asked if Dante was there, and Camilla, who was back on shift, who seemed, Dante thought, to be on shift with an unusual frequency, which he attributed to the particular dedication of someone who had invested personally in how this story ended, told her yes, that he was in the corridor. Seraphina asked him to come in. He came in. She was more present than the morning, the color incrementally better, the eyes clearer, the voice less carefully rationed. She had the water and she set it on the table beside her, and she looked at him with the direct assessment that had been her characteristic from the beginning. "Tell me about Moreno," she said. He sat down. He told her. He told her the full version, not the summary he might once have offered, the edited operational briefing, but the actual account of standing in that cabin and looking at a man he had known for 30 years and hearing the shape of a grievance that had been maintained across all of it. He told her what Moreno had said about the Eastern consolidation and about the title and the equity and the 30 years of patient construction. He told her what it had felt like to stand there and receive that. Seraphina listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." He looked at his hands. "That's the honest answer." "Okay." "I know what the organization requires," he said. "I know what the operational response looks like, what precedent demands, what the people around me would expect." He looked at her. "I also know that he's 71 years old, and I knew him when I was 4. And I know those two things don't cancel each other out, and I don't know yet how to hold them both." Seraphina looked at him. "That's a more human answer than I expected," she said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was something more valuable, an acknowledgement. He nodded. They sat. "Camilla told me something this morning," Seraphina said. "While you were gone, she told me that Eli's oxygen support was reduced at 6 a.m. They decreased the assistance level, and his numbers held." She looked at the window. "He's breathing more on his own." Dante felt something in his chest shift. "She also said," Seraphina continued, "that she was there when he was brought in after delivery, that she was the one who held him first before they took him to the NICU." She turned back to Dante. "She said he was loud. She said for a 2-pound, 14-ounce, 30-week baby who'd had a difficult delivery, he was extremely loud." Dante looked at his wife. "He's going to be difficult," Seraphina said. There was something in her voice that was not quite a smile, but was the precondition for one. "Good," Dante said. The afternoon passed in the particular slowness of hospital afternoons. The low light, the quiet rounds, the sense of time moving differently inside these walls than outside them. Dante stayed. He did not leave to make calls. He did not step out of the room for operational conversations. He had given Castellano authority to handle what needed handling, and he trusted Castellano, and he remained in the room. At 4:17, Dr. Okafor came in for his afternoon review. He checked Seraphina's readings with the attention of someone who was genuinely pleased by what he saw. Blood pressure down. specific markers improving. The cautious but real language of a man who is beginning to allow himself a measured optimism. Another 48 hours of close monitoring, he said. After that, if these trends continue, we begin talking about stepping down from high-dependency care. He looked at Seraphina. Your body has been through an extraordinary amount. Recovery is going to take time, and it's going to require you to actually rest, which, based on my experience of the past few weeks, is not your natural inclination. Seraphina said, I'll rest. The doctor looked at Dante. Dante said, I'll make sure she rests. Okafor looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had watched enough marriages from the particular vantage point of medical crisis to know what the ones that were going to hold looked like, and what the ones that weren't looked like, and what the ones in the complicated middle looked like. And what he seemed to see in this room he kept to himself professionally, but it moved across his face for a moment before he controlled it. He left. The evening came. Dante went to the NICU at 6 and sat with Eli again. The nursing staff had adjusted to his presence. He came, he sat, he watched, he asked specific questions about the medical indicators and received specific answers and did not perform anything. Tara told him that the 6 a.m. oxygen reduction had held through the day. She told him that Eli's feeding tolerance was developing better than the standard 30-week projection. She said these things with the same careful precision as before, and Dante received them the same way and then sat in the chair and looked at his son for 40 minutes, in the particular silence of a man who is learning a new vocabulary. He had held power for 12 years. He had held fear for longer than that. He had held the organization and the weight of inherited empire and the sustained performance of a man who needed no one. He had not held anything like this before. The incubator glass was between them. The breathing support moved Eli's small chest in its steady rhythm. The monitors traced the evidence of progress in their patient lines. Dante looked at his son's hands. He thought about the letter against his chest. He took it out. He read it again. The 3 sentences, the specific weight of the last one, I would choose him again. And he sat with it for a long time in the NICU beside his son's incubator, and the particular quality of that time was something he would carry for the rest of his life without ever quite finding words for it. He went back to Seraphina at 8. She was awake. Camilla had been in and brought her something to eat, actual food, not the institutional tray, something from outside. And she was finishing it when Dante came in, and she looked at him and said, How is he? Good. Better, breathing more on his own. She set the food down and looked at the window. I haven't seen him, she said. It was very quiet, the way she said it. The quietness of something that had been sitting in her chest all day. The doctor says in 2 days, if your numbers hold, they can bring a monitor to you, or possibly take you up to the NICU in a wheelchair. He sat down. 2 days. She nodded. She was quiet. Seraphina. She looked at him. 2 days, he said again. I'll be there. She looked at him for a moment with the particular evaluation he knew, the deep reading, and then she looked back at the window and said, Okay. That night he slept in the chair beside her bed. Not well. Not for long. The chair was the same institutional quality as every other chair in this building, and he was a large man in a small chair, and the sleep was shallow and interrupted. He woke twice to check the monitors without knowing why he woke. Some animal attentiveness to the sounds of the room that he had apparently developed in the past 24 hours. Both times the monitors were steady. Both times Seraphina was sleeping, her chest moving in the even rhythm of someone finally, genuinely resting. Both times he sat for a moment and listened, and then closed his eyes again. In the morning, he went to the bathroom down the hall and washed his face and looked at himself in the mirror for the first time in, he couldn't calculate exactly, time had lost its normal structure over the past 2 days. He looked like what he was. A man who had been up for most of 2 days conducting a dismantlement and sitting in hospital chairs and learning, in his late 30s, the specific cost of the choices he had made in his mid-30s. He looked older. He was not certain this was wrong. At 9 in the morning, Castellano came to the hospital. He waited in the lobby. He knew not to come to the ward, and Dante went down to him. They sat in the corner of the lobby that was least trafficked, 2 men in the informal costume of people who had been working without full sleep, and Castellano put a folder on the low table between them. Everything is documented, Castellano said. The financial recovery will take 3 to 4 months through the legal process, but there's nothing disputed. Luca's deposition and the records from Moreno's communication logs are comprehensive. He looked at Dante. The Valdez network received Moreno's communication yesterday afternoon. Their response came through 6 hours later. They're withdrawing. Dante nodded. They were never fully committed, Castellano said. Celeste's provocation scenario was dependent on your response looking like an attack. When you didn't respond to the West Side hit, they got cautious. Moreno's communication gave them the exit they were looking for. He paused. They lost nothing significant. They'll reposition and stay away. For now, yes. Good. Dante looked at the folder. What's in there? Moreno's full accounting, the 30-year history. His version of it, which may not be your father's version, which we can't get now. Castellano said this carefully, the way he said difficult things. The financial record of the original arrangement, what your father promised, and what he delivered. Dante looked at the folder. Is it accurate? He said. Moreno's version of what he was owed. Castellano was quiet for a moment. I pulled the original consolidation records, he said, from your father's archive. The 78 agreements. He held Dante's gaze. They describe a partnership arrangement, equal equity in the Eastern operations. It was amended 2 years later. The amendment is in the same archive, reducing Moreno's position to advisory with a fixed compensation. He paused. The amendment bears your father's signature. Moreno's signature is not on it. The lobby moved around them, people crossing, nurses changing shifts, the ordinary movement of a building full of lives at various stages of crisis and recovery. So he wasn't wrong, Dante said, about what he was originally owed. No, he wasn't wrong. Castellano looked at the folder. What he did with that grievance, that's a different conversation. Dante picked up the folder. He held it. I'm going to need you to run the Eastern operations through the legal restructure, he said. Everything that connects to Celeste's architecture gets rebuilt through legitimate channels. It's going to cost us operational capacity for 6 to 8 months. Yes. Do it anyway. Castellano nodded. And Luca, Dante said. He's in the secondary facility, waiting. Dante thought about 4 years of development. He thought about the letter. He thought about the 7th month, the specific day and hour Luca had named, the moment he'd known and chosen silence. He doesn't come back to the organization, Dante said. That's not negotiable. What he did, the duration of it, the choice to stay silent while Seraphina was in a hospital building, evidence that should have been his to bring. That's not something that has a place to go inside what I'm building. He paused. But he's 28. He has the full deposition on record. He cooperated completely. That has to mean something about what his life looks like from here. He looked at Castellano. Help him disappear cleanly, not in that way. Help him start somewhere else. New city, enough money to live on for a year, clean paperwork where clean paperwork is mine to give. Castellano looked at him. He's 28, Dante said again. It was the full explanation. Castellano picked up his own folder and stood. I'll handle it. He left. Dante sat in the lobby for a few minutes with the 30-year archive folder in his hands. Then he went to the elevator. He went to the NICU floor, not his wife's floor. He walked to the unit and identified himself and went in and sat beside Eli's incubator. He put the folder on the floor beside his chair. He looked at his son. He thought about what he was going to do about Moreno. He had been turning it over since the marina, not with the urgency of the operational question, which had been resolved, but with the slower consideration of something that was simultaneously more and less than operational. Moreno had built the architecture of a betrayal that had endangered Seraphina and Eli. He had also been cheated 30 years ago by a man Dante had loved. He was 71 and guilty, and also the product of a wrong that Dante's family had done to him and never acknowledged. There was no clean version of this. Dante had known, on the drive back from the marina, that there was not going to be a clean version of this, and he had decided in the absence of a clean version to take the honest version instead. He called Castellano. Moreno, he said. He's not going to a facility. He's 71 and he cooperated, and he's going to spend whatever he has left of his life somewhere that isn't my city, with the understanding that if he surfaces in my business in any form, that changes. He paused. The money he was supposed to get from Celeste's extraction, whatever was allocated to him, I want the equivalent calculated against what the original 78 agreement would have entitled him to. 30 years of what he was promised. A pause. If there's a number there, I want to know it. Castellano was very quiet. Dante. I know, Dante said. I know what it looks like. I know what Castellano thinks it looks like, and I know what the organization thinks it looks like, and I don't care. My father made a promise and broke it, and 3 people are in positions they shouldn't be in, and my wife spent 16 days in a hospital bed because of the chain that started with that promise. His voice was completely even. Calculate the number. Tell me what it is. Yes, Castellano said. Dante ended the call. He sat with Eli. 40 minutes. Then he went back to Seraphina. He did not tell her about the Moreno decision that day. He told her later, a week later, when she was in the step-down room and her numbers were significantly better and the conversation had the space it required. He told her fully and she listened fully, and she was quiet for a long time afterward. And then she said, "That's going to be complicated for you." Yes. Are you at peace with it? He thought about this honestly. No, not yet. I think it's the right thing, and I think that's going to have to be enough for now. She looked at him. That's honest, she said. I'm trying to be honest with you, he said. I know I'm late to that. I'm trying. She looked at the window. I know, she said. I can tell. The 48 hours passed. On the morning of the 3rd day, Seraphina's blood pressure registered within a normal range for the first time in 11 days. Dr. Okafor came in at 9 and reviewed the readings and reviewed the secondary markers and looked at his patient with the expression of a man who has been doing difficult work and is allowing himself to acknowledge that it has gone well. Let's talk about moving you to standard care, he said. Seraphina looked at Dante. Dante looked at the doctor. And the NICU visit, Dante said. Okafor looked between them. This afternoon, he said. We'll arrange it this afternoon. He left. Seraphina put her hands in her lap and looked at them. Her hands, Dante noticed, were trembling slightly. A fine, controlled tremor that was not weakness. It was the specific physical expression of something too large for the body to hold without showing. Hey, he said. She looked up. This afternoon, he said. She nodded. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of him throughout any of this. He had noticed this and had not remarked on it, because it was hers. That composure. It belonged to her. It was not something she owed him access to. But the tremor in her hands was visible, and he reached out and covered her hands with his and held them until the trembling stopped. She let him. At 2 p.m, they brought a wheelchair, and Camilla came, off her official shift, but present anyway. And Dante walked beside the chair as they took Seraphina down the corridor to the elevator and up 2 floors and through the NICU doors. Tara met them. She walked them to incubator 14. Seraphina looked at her son. She was very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that contained a great deal of movement beneath it, the full reorganization of a person around a new center of gravity. Then she put her hand to the incubator glass. Eli was sleeping. His small chest moved in the steady rhythm of breathing that was today mostly his own. The support reduced again overnight, the numbers continuing their cautious improvement. His hands were loose at his sides. He has your forehead, Dante said. He said it quietly, because the NICU required quiet, and also because this moment required it. Seraphina looked for a long time. Then she looked at Dante. Can I hold him? She asked Tara. Tara looked at the chart. She looked at Eli's numbers. She looked at the incubator and back at the chart, and she made the specific decision of a nurse who trusts her assessment more than she trusts the protocol in borderline situations. Yes, she said, for a short time, carefully. She showed Seraphina how. The specific positioning, the skin-to-skin contact that was both medically beneficial and the most human thing in the room, a mother holding her early son against her chest, his monitors still connected, his breathing still supported, the wires accommodated without disrupting the fundamental fact of the contact. Seraphina held him. Dante stood beside her chair and did not speak and did not look at anything except his wife holding his son and the specific quality of Seraphina's face in that moment. Everything she had carried, all of it, the 16 days and the folder and the belt and the voicemails and the 3-sentence letter and the choice she had made to protect a man who hadn't protected her. all of it visible in how she held that small body against her chest like he was the most important thing she had ever done, which he was, which they both were. The weeks that followed were not a resolution. Dante had no illusions about resolution. Resolution was a thing that happened in accounts of events, not in the events themselves. What happened in the events themselves was slower and less clean and more daily. Seraphina came home after 12 days. Eli stayed in the NICU for 41 days before his numbers cleared every threshold, and he came home in a car seat that dwarfed him, wrapped in blankets, sleeping through the entire drive with the serene indifference of a small person who had already proven he could handle difficulty and saw no reason to perform anxiety about the car. The house was different, not the house itself. The house was the same rooms, same light, same furniture. But Dante had, in the days before Seraphina came home, removed things. Not dramatically, not in a gesture, just quietly, methodically. The secondary phone that he'd kept for operational contacts that had nothing to do with legitimate business. The particular set of habits that had organized his life around the organization's rhythms first and everything else second. The expectation that his presence in a room constituted presence. He restructured the organization. This took 4 months and was unglamorous work. The kind of work that didn't make anyone feel powerful, that required constant re-examination of operational decisions that had compounded over years, that meant some capabilities were reduced and some relationships ended, and some income sources were closed because they required a level of exposure and risk that Dante had decided his family could not absorb. Castellano managed the day-to-day. Dante was home by 7. This sounds small. It was not small. It was the most significant operational change he had made in 12 years, and the people around him understood it as such, and took their signals from it, and some of them left because they preferred the previous version, and some of them stayed because they preferred this one. And the organization that came out of the 4 months was smaller and more defensible and less immediately powerful and considerably more stable. He was home by 7. He learned Eli's medication schedule. There were 2 medications in the early weeks, post-NICU, and Dante memorized the doses and the times and the specific way each needed to be administered with the same focused attention he had once applied to operational briefings. Seraphina noticed this without remarking on it. She noticed a great many things without remarking on them, because she was not, as a rule, a person who needed to name everything she saw. She was also healing, not quickly, not linearly. There were days when the exhaustion of what her body had been through landed on her without warning and required her to stop whatever she was doing and rest, which she did with the particular ungrace of a person who found resting genuinely difficult. There were nights when something woke her, not Eli, who was a surprisingly cooperative sleeper for a child who had arrived with such difficulty, but something internal, some processing happening below the level of consciousness. And she would lie awake, and Dante would feel her awake, and would not speak, just shift his position slightly so that the point of contact between them, shoulder, arm, whatever they happened to be touching, was deliberate. She always went back to sleep. The conversation about forgiveness happened on a Sunday morning 4 months after Eli came home. They had not planned it. Planning it would have been wrong, would have made it a performance, a scene, something that required the right words arranged in the right order. Instead, it happened the way the real things happened, which was sideways and unexpectedly, while they were doing something else entirely. Seraphina was sitting at the kitchen table with Eli asleep against her chest, the position she had arrived at by instinct and maintained because it was the position from which she could feel his breathing, and he seemed, in it, most settled. Dante was making coffee. The morning light was doing what morning light does, and the house was quiet. He set the coffee on the table and sat across from her and looked at his son sleeping on his wife's chest. Seraphina said, "I'm not there yet." He looked at her. Forgiveness. It's not something I can give you like a thing. She looked at Eli. "I'm not angry. I want you to know that. The anger was real when it was there, and I don't carry it anymore. But forgiveness is different from not being angry, and I need you to know I understand the difference." "I know," he said. "I need to know, you know." She looked at him. "Because there was a version of this where you came back and held my hand, and I said I forgave you, and we called it done, and I don't want that version. That version would make everything I did mean something smaller than it meant." He held her gaze. "What you did in that hospital," he said, The folder. 6 weeks in a hospital bed with a dangerous pregnancy. The folder and the letter and the way you kept protecting me even when I... Seraphina. His voice did the rough thing. I know what that cost you. I know it cost you things I'm still finding out about. She looked at him. What I want, she said, is for this to be the version of you that stays. Not because it's convenient, not because you went through something hard and came out of it better and now it's settled. She shifted Eli slightly on her chest. I want you to choose it every day, including the days when it's more expensive than going back to who you were. She looked at him with the direct evaluation he had always known meant she was reading the man below the performance. Can you do that? He looked at his wife. He looked at his son sleeping against her chest. He thought about a Tuesday morning and a kitchen and a test result, and a man who kissed his wife's forehead and understood for one unguarded second what he had been building without knowing it. He thought about a plastic chair in a hospital corridor. He thought about a 3-sentence letter. He thought about what it had cost her to write. I would choose him again while she was sitting in a hospital bed with a cut on her face and his child in her body and the full knowledge of everything he had failed to be. Yes, he said. One word. The same weight as Moreno's yes, but entirely different in direction. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table. He took her hand. Eli slept on her chest and made the small, involuntary sounds of a sleeping infant. The mouth movements, the occasional twitch of those small hands, and the morning light moved across the kitchen table where two imperfect people sat holding on to each other with the specific grip of people who have come through something and are choosing, every day including this one, to keep coming through it together. There was no elegance in it. There was no clean resolution. There was only this: a man who had learned, at considerable cost, the difference between possessing someone and showing up for them. A woman who had known that difference all along and had waited, at considerable cost, for the man to find it himself, because she understood that a man who is told what he must become does not become it in any way that holds. And between them, on the kitchen table, a coffee cup going cold because neither of them had moved to drink it. And in Seraphina's arms, Eli, breathing steadily, both lungs working now, the battle of his first weeks behind him, sleeping with the absolute trust of someone who has already been through the hardest part of arriving and has decided, having arrived, that the world he found here is worth staying in. The kitchen was quiet.